deployed in Europe come from China. If we just look at another example, if the next slide, please. We look at batteries, for example, a different market here. So this is a more nascent market and is very dynamic, but we still already see 10% of global deployment of electric vehicles using batteries being traded today, again, with a common pattern where we see, an important flow from China towards Europe, where we see that 1 out of 3 of the electric vehicles that are sold, let's say, in Europe, use batteries that have been manufactured in China. And of course, there's also other players here, Japan and Korea being also important producers, and the environment is very dynamic. We've seen how countries are developing industrial strategies, different regulations to secure and to attract investments in their own economies, to diversify their supplies for this type of commodities, to create economic opportunities at the same time. And we see how the pipeline of these expansions of manufacturing activities in particular, but also starting to go upstream in the supply chain, are growing by the day. And actually, this brings me to the next slide, where I wanted to give us, a sense of, how big this market could be. So what we've done is to analyze how the markets, in particular of clean technology manufacturing, so focusing here in the last step of the supply chain, but we've done the same analysis for earlier stages of the supply chain, could evolve in the future. So we at the IEA gather information on what are the announcements from all the different countries in terms of their pledges, their commitments to really advance in the clean energy transition, and what this could imply in terms of the level of demand for all of these commodities. When we put all of this together, we see that globally by 2030, for all countries to meet their climate pledges, the market of mass manufactured clean energy technologies would be around $650 billion. This means that to fulfill or to supply that market, if we go to the next click, we see that actually, we would be getting close to that. When we look at, how the announcements for different expansions of manufacturing activities for component manufacturing, technology manufacturing, etc., are growing in different markets. If we put all of these announcements together, then we see that, that market could start to be fulfilled. But of course, it's quite interesting to see here the regional positioning when we compare what could be the potential supply of these technologies in different economies versus what would be the level of demand for these technologies that you see here in yellow, that would be compatible again to these pledges. What we see here is that if that kind of pipeline of manufacturing projects was to be realized, China would be well set to absorb around 2/3 of that market, of that future market. And that level of output, of potential output, would be in excess of what the size of their domestic market would be, which would be still keep growing. This means that, again, would be potentially well positioned to, again, have an important, let's say, orientation towards exports to other markets. But it's quite interesting to see as well here that, as I've mentioned, this is very dynamic. And we're seeing important investments moving forward, particularly, for example, in the United States, where we've seen that the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year is really attracting a lot of investments, particularly in the battery supply chain, but also other elements around PV and electrolyzers for hydrogen production. Similarly, in Europe, more recently, the Net Zero Industry Act also is calling for facilitating investments in this type of activities. And we see this as a bit as a trend in other countries when we think about the PLI scheme in India, the different green transformation targets in Japan, different Chinese targets, of course, and many more. And so it's quite interesting to see, again, that this environment of investment is very dynamic. Since we've let's say, develop this analysis, we have set up a system to monitor this type of announcements on a continuous basis. And this analysis was published in January. Already in May, we produced a report for the G7 leaders, looking at the status of the clean energy technology manufacturing. And just in that short period of time, we saw how, again, the project pipeline shifted quite a lot. We are going to be releasing in the next couple of weeks an update of that analysis. It's all publicly available before COP28, again, to look at how investments are progressing. And what we're seeing is that actually, if we look at the pipeline of investments, if we look at solar PV manufacturing, battery manufacturing, and electrolyzers for hydrogen production manufacturing, if all those pipelines would be materialized, there could be enough supply globally to fulfill the needs for a trajectory that could not even meet country pledges, but that could meet net zero emissions by 2050 goals, which is really the global climate goal that we're seeing, that would be keeping the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which is really the final goal here. Two caveats for this. One is that on one hand, all of these projects are not as certain as, let's say, established operations. So here we're talking about projects that have already started construction or that have reached final investment decisions. So they are very certain, but there are some also that are more preliminary. And so not all of these projects could see the light of the day. But again, that's something quite interesting to monitor. Also considering that the lead time to make these projects operational, it's between 1 to 3 years on average. So again, things can move quite quickly. Just to give a little bit of a point of context for this, for example, in the case of solar PV manufacturing, the global average is that around a quarter of all the announced projects are in this advanced stage status, so under construction or final investment decision. In the case of batteries, it's around 30%. In the case of electrolyzers for hydrogen, it's around 10%, because those are technologies that are a bit more nascent, so to speak. So just wanted to give a bit that sense of uncertainty, and at the same time, the opportunity, which is the second caveat, that as I've mentioned, things are changing very rapidly, and this type of projects could be implemented very quickly. The next slide, sorry, thank you. I wanted to make a final kind of quantitative element on this point quickly, is that competitiveness would remain, in our view, a key important factor for this type of investments, and as a consequence for the patterns that trade could have in the future, when we think about, again, energy trade and the trade of clean energy technologies. We think this is going to be a remaining factor, because this is a key influencing factor for production costs. Not the only one, of course, but a very important one. And we wanted to illustrate this by using hydrogen as an example. Hydrogen today is produced in most cases from fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, and is produced at a cost between $1 to $3 per kilo. Now, we are seeing how more and more hydrogen is produced from electricity. This is still more costly in most regional contexts. But when we see high potential for renewable resources, this is starting to become competitive in some cases, and would increasingly do so as countries progress in their transition. The cost of electrolyzers gets down, the cost to produce renewable electricity gets down, and the cost to store hydrogen gets down. By 2030, looking at our geospatial analysis, we expect that in quite a few regions, producing hydrogen from renewable electricity would be, let's say, competitive compared to conventional routes today. But of course, as producing oil and gas, the cost of doing that differs across regions today. The same will happen in the future for hydrogen, because there's different regional costs to produce renewable electricity, because the renewable sources are different. And this is the result where we see that, countries like China, India, United States could be better positioned in terms of energy costs in the future for this particular commodity compared to Western Europe or Japan, for example. If you go to the next click, please, thank you. We see that this could have knock-on effects on other commodities, because in the future, we'll see, for example, that steel wouldn't be produced from coal or natural gas, but then we see increasingly steel being produced from hydrogen, for example, and other routes, but that could be one of them. And then it's quite interesting to see how the production of steel, the cost of producing steel, could be affected by this regional variation in the production, in the cost of producing hydrogen. This is important because steel is widely traded, as you all know. And again, we see, for example, that today regions like Europe is at the forefront of developing the technologies that can take advantage of hydrogen to produce steel. So that's a competitive advantage that, if it's well valued by differentiating this type of market, and in a way making sure that this lower emissions footprint for this type of material is well recognized, and it can compete in international markets with a premium that is clear and is transparent, this would be a competitive advantage that can be explored. But moving forward, as more regions start to produce steel in this way, the competitive advantage could be more even. And this is where, again, access to low cost or low cost energy would become the predominant factor. Again, that's not the only factor for competitiveness. There's also, skill, force, industrial base, synergies with other industries. There's many more elements, but that's one from the International Energy Agency, of course, perspective that is quite important to monitor. If we just go to the next slide, just to have a quick fine point connected a little bit to this last element. For commodities that are not energy related, let's say they are more materials, but they are the production is clearly connected to the let's say cost of energy. We really see the need of having common definitions that can really unlock future trade. This is another area where we've been doing quite a lot of work in the recent years, and we're happy to expand more in the discussion on this. And I just put it here an example of a definition and some near zero principles in terms of emissions that we suggested to the G7, but that could be applicable to other regions for the case of steel. As I've mentioned before, steel in the future could be produced through different routes that could be more expensive than conventional steel, at least today. For those routes to deploy it and to enter into the market, there needs to be some mechanisms that recognize the advantage from an environmental perspective of this type of routes. And that needs to be robust, that needs to be transparent, and there needs to be some, common consensus or some certain level of agreement so that there's an enough critical mass market for this to get started. And this is the type of definitions and work that we've been doing in the space of materials to clearly define what we are talking about when we say near zero emissions steel. What level of emissions, how it's produced, how we can measure those emissions in a transparent and coherent way with a net zero emissions pathway, so that, again, we could establish standards for this type of materials to be traded in the future market. And then just quickly moving to the next slide on conclusions. Few takeaways first. We see really there's a lot of nexus and interrelations between energy, environment, technology, and trade, which means that there's a lot of different facets of policy that need to come together in an all-of-government approach, really to make sure that we have coordinated and complementary measures here to progress in the transition in a just and secure way. Bringing to the next point, security will remain an important element of energy supply chains in the future as we progress in the clean energy transition. And that's going to be, in a way, drawing a different kind of regional map, but still, again, we see a common denominator factor compared to the system today, which is that we see high levels of regional concentration in all of these different steps of the supply chain, which need to be monitored, need to be addressed. Third point is about resilience and sustainability. Those are the two additional pillars, together with security, that we see being critical in the clean energy transition for the supply chains. Resilience, because we've seen in the latest period how market disruptions, fluctuations of prices have very important impacts on costs and the pace of the transition. We saw, for example, how after more than a decade of cost reductions for batteries and PV cells, we saw how the cost of this technology started to flatten and in some cases slightly increase because of some of the temporary bottlenecks and shortages in the supply chains. Sustainability, because even if all of these technologies would be enabling a clean energy system, the production of these technologies are not, let's say, completely clean today. So they also produce emissions in those operations, and that's something we need to monitor. As those operations would grow and would expand, their emissions would do if we don't do anything to transform those elements as well. Fourth element, very quickly, is on industrial strategies. So as I mentioned, we have an emerging industrial age in front of us, which is related to clean energy technologies, lots of opportunities, lots of risks as well. And we have to recognize that not all countries would be able to compete in all the supply chains or in all steps of the supply chain. So very important here to identify weaknesses and strengths. So we could really look at, competitive and complementary strategic partnerships that can really make the most of the transition for socioeconomic development and for security, resilience, and sustainability. And then finally, time is of essence. So of course, from a clean energy transition perspective, we are already, very tight in terms of the timing, and we need to really reduce emissions very quickly. So it's really important to expand and deploy all of the supply chains quickly, but at the same time, keeping in mind all of these vulnerabilities, but opportunities. So to turn them into opportunities in an efficient way. And I think this is where, again, organizations like, WTO, working with IEA and many others, working with our countries together, have a lot of opportunities to, again, connect all of these considerations and progress in that topic. I'll leave you here. Sorry if I extended a little bit too much, but happy to join the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Araceli, really, for a very rich presentation. It was very useful to hear about your analytical work regarding both current trends in energy sector, but also about the clean energy supply chains, the opportunities, the risks, both in terms of demand and supply. It seems to be a very dynamic sector indeed, and as you say, needs a coherent policy approach. So thank you very much for setting the stage for our discussions today. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Mr. Andres Valenciano Yamuni, Director for the Washington, D.C. Office Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. Previously, Andres was the Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. He also served as the Executive President of the Instituto Nacional de Aprendizaje and as the Executive Director of several NGOs. Andres, I would like to invite you to share with us the experience of ECLAC's members with energy transition, and what can the WTO do to support developing countries in this endeavor? Andres, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at the WTO, not only alongside fellow panelists, but also with my former colleagues from the mission to the WTO from Costa Rica. So pleasure to be here. My comments are going to be structured in two main points. One is I'm going to provide an overview of what is the situation in Latin America, and I'm sure many other developing countries in the global south will probably relate to the situation that our countries are living, and then how the WTO and the multilateral trading system can actually support the energy transition for countries like ours. So in terms of the general context for Latin America, my main point is that the world needs Latin America to play a role in this transition. Countries in the region hold critical and important resources like minerals. We have carbon absorption capacity, we have biodiversity. And just to give you a couple of examples, critical minerals in Latin America account for 40% of the global production of copper. As you saw, more than 50% of the global lithium reserves are here, and Brazil alone holds almost 1/5 of the global reserves of graphite, nickel, manganese, and rare earth minerals. In terms of energy, 60% of the region's electricity is based on renewables, which is twice the global average. But at the same time, the region is home to 40% of the world's biodiversity, more than 50% of the world's primary forests, and almost 1/3 of the planet's fresh water, which means we do have to play a big role in the energy transition, both for climate mitigation and obviously adaptation for our countries. But at the same time, developing countries are facing unprecedented levels of debt, and they lack the capacity to fully tap into all this potential. Reports by the UN highlight how, for example, in Latin America, more than half the population, that means 350 million people, are living in countries that are spending more on interest in their debts than on health. And overall, there are close to 10 countries in the region that spend more on interest payments than on investment. So Latin America and the Caribbean is disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change as well. 13 of the 50 most affected countries by climate change are in this region. So the region has a lot of potential, as you can imagine, but there are risks and challenges that need to be addressed, including the need for new resources and more capital for Latin America. And even in a scenario where there's a huge debt forgiveness and debt restructuring programs for the region, there still would be a need for trillions of dollars of investment to be channeled for this transition. So this is where the private sector plays a key role. And in this regard, the multilateral trading system and the WTO can help trade work as a tool for development and support the climate agenda. So moving on to the second section of how the WTO and the trade system can support us, as you can imagine, trade plays a critical role in helping to channel know-how, technology, and financial resources to the developing world. And this is absolutely essential for all the industries that are at the core of the energy transition, meaning renewables, transportation, critical minerals, and food systems. So I'm going to provide 3 key ways in which the WTO and trade can support this. First of all, the multilateral trade system needs to work to minimize tariff and non-tariff barriers to the dissemination of environmental goods and services, and circular goods as well. Given the abundance of renewable energy in Latin America and the many commitments to the green agenda that many of our countries have, an agreement to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services would not only improve market access for all our countries, it would also help the world accelerate progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, we need to keep working on agreed criteria on the definition and standards of what actually are environmental goods, services, and technologies. But there's also significant progress in this end. For example, the ACCTS, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, which is an open and plurilateral agreement, has already made significant progress in working to define environmental goods and services, and eco-labeling, and avoiding greenwashing. The WTO could learn from these negotiations and continue to work with other members alongside other international organizations such as UNFCCC to define the objective criteria of the environmental impact of trade liberalization. We have another example right here at the WTO, the Trade and Environmental and Sustainability Structure Discussions, TESDI, co-led by Canada and also my country of Costa Rica, has made significant progress on identifying goods and services that are key for renewable energies, and particular attention has been given to the issues faced by developing economies, which again, really important for this discussion. The WTO and its members should work to deliver a statement on trade and sustainability at MC13. Second, WTO and partner organizations should continue to work to develop standards for circular goods across the whole product's life cycle. Recent research that we've done at ECLAC highlight how the circular economy is a potential driver for green growth, but circular and potentially circular products account for less than 3% of the volume of global merchandise trade around the world. By improving the accessibility of materials and goods, establishing registers of circular suppliers, creating international agreed definition of these goods, and removing importation bans of used goods and waste in general can contribute to multiple savings in raw materials, energy, water for industries that are critical for Latin America, such as livestock farming, fishing, aquaculture, and forestry. Here was, once again, TESDI working group has made progress in mapping measures related to circular economy, but a lot more work needs to be done to understand the linkages between trade liberalization, trade facilitation, and the circular economy. Third, having clear definitions and standards will help the WTO and its members offer developing countries preferential market access for sustainable products and services. And this has to be, we have to be creative. We have to think it could be done through the generalized system of preference schemes or through a special waiver by improving market access for environmental goods, like I mentioned, is critical then for the climate agenda. So the second point in how we can address the link between trade and sustainability has to do with greenhouse gas emissions and CBAM. Research recently done by ECLAC again indicates that as it stands right now, CBAM has, let's say, a limited impact on countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. But we expect the mechanism to continue to evolve to include other goods. For example, if vehicles and machinery were to be included, which are heavily rely on steel and iron, it would significantly impact, for example, Mexico and other countries. This impact will come not only from the potential market barriers, but also on the additional burden and expensive process required to demonstrate emissions by companies and governments alike. So research by ECLAC has shown that this has the potential to disproportionately impact small and medium enterprises and could even increase gender gaps, because given women are underrepresented in technical fields such as those associated with renewable energy. But not everything is bad news. CBAMs can also represent opportunities for countries in Latin America, given our renewable energy matrix, which could be a driver for foreign direct investment in the region for companies that are looking to minimize their carbon footprint and better prepare themselves for other CBAMs. At the same time, countries in the region will need to promote green job policies and support for SMEs. As I mentioned, taking a gender perspective to provide opportunities for individuals and companies to transition from brown to green industries. In this sense, the WTO should, A, work with its members to try to align CBAMs with WTO regulations, and also have more and better data on the carbon content on the production system, and which countries and how their balance of payments are going to be affected by CBAMs. For example, in Latin America, we need more data to fully understand the attempt of CBAM to reduce carbon emissions in the production and the supply chain of industries, including how the impact will be disproportionately, like I mentioned, on SMEs. Here is an idea that might be far-fetched, but I think the WTO should try to discuss it, which is what should be done with the revenue obtained through CBAM. And we can think of it as this revenue will be collected from a lot of developing countries. So we could use that revenue to set up a fund to support decarbonization efforts and drive investment in the global south. This fund could be used to de-risk some of the investments that could be done in regions like Latin America and Africa, that because of high levels of risk, companies are not allocating capital over there. Finally, the third point has to do with technical assistance and finance for domestic policy reforms. Countries in Latin America and other developing parts of the world need to launch ambitious productive development policies to be able to escape not only the trap of low growth, but also to advance the green transition. As I mentioned before, this happens in a context of very tight fiscal space, which requires the region to strengthen institutions, to create public-private coordination mechanisms, improve the investment climate, and enable a positive business environment for all firms. This will allow countries to attract new sources of investment that is needed because of this very tight fiscal space. In this regard, the WTO should increase its aid for trade to support trade-related capacity building for developing countries and improve the supply chain side constraints presented in countries in the region. And this would be done working closely with UNCTAD, ITC, regional organizations like ECLAC and the development banks to support policy coherence, try to align national and international priorities, making sure trade policies are working in tandem with the green agenda and helping to mainstream SDGs into national policies. For example, a recent report that we published at ECLAC presents guidelines for how a productive development agenda around lithium in Latin America and the greening of supply chains of critical minerals in general can be done when understanding the rules of trade, but also the need for countries to enact industrial policies to be able to develop. This report suggests that better governance models and innovative public-private partnerships are needed to ensure the transfer of knowledge and technology and to attract foreign investment. Aid for trade can be a part of this policy toolkit that support policies that allow countries to extract, manufacture, and export lithium and other critical minerals, and doing so in a way that has high levels of socio-environmental standards. So, having said those three big areas in which I believe the WTO can play a big role in linking the trade agenda with the climate ambition, just to summarize, trade liberalization of sustainable goods and services and circular goods, working around CBAM and more data for greenhouse gas emissions, and finally, technical assistance and financing for the domestic policy reforms that need to happen in our developing countries to be able to attract the capital that is very much needed for this transition. So to finish, one final recommendation. This is a massive undertaking, and the WTO can't do it all. The WTO needs to work closely with environmental agencies and other organizations on all these issues. Regional bodies like ECLAC have to be part of the equation, because for far too long, there has been a siloed approach towards trade and climate. And that's why I celebrate that this year's COP28 will include a whole week on trade-related events. But more needs to be done to bridge disciplines and work together for the common good. ECLAC is ready to support these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andres, for a very rich presentation. I think it was very interesting to hear about the potential and challenges in the Latin American region, and especially how what kind of a critical role trade and the WTO can play. And you mentioned, for example, environmental goods and services, circular goods, reducing carbon emissions and better data, investments and technical assistance. I think a common theme that has emerged from the two presentations so far has been, first of all, the importance of coherence, policy coherence, and then secondly, cooperation between international organizations. Thank you very much, Andres. Let's turn to our next speaker, Ms. Antti, Associate Research Professor from the Renewable Energy Development Research Center at the Energy Research Institute at the Chinese Academy of Macroeconomic Research. Antti has been working on China's energy transition strategies and policies, energy systems analysis and outlook, renewable energy development, energy market reform, and carbon pricing. Antti has also been providing technical support to the government of China on international dialogues on energy and climate change, including COP and G20 fora. Antti, I would like to invite you to share with us China's outlook on carbon neutrality and what is the role of trade policy in contributing to the energy transition. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vitti. Distinguished guests, good morning, good afternoon. So really thank you very much for invitation to join this important discussion at WTO. And I'm really glad to share a perspective based on China's practice and outlook. So ERI is a governmental think tank specializing in energy policies. And for recent years, we've been observing that we are increasingly engaged with trade and environmental discussions for two reasons. One is that energy-related activities accounts for 80% of the carbon dioxide emissions in China. So we're the main contributor to the mitigation of climate change. And secondly, there are growing green trade opportunities related to new energy technologies. So today I will be sharing a glance of the updates of China's energy transition progress and share a research result from our institute on the energy outlook in China and a few thoughts on the implications on trade. So the energy transition in China is driven by a wider global background with the key to address multiple crises, the climate emergency. So we are not only facing climate change, but from the current indices, we are still having the gap to reach 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C within reach. So, and also we've seen for the past few years, the energy crisis reflected by the very high fossil fuel prices has been taking place. So what we are observing is that the response from global countries is not delaying the energy transition, but the carbon neutrality consensus has been strengthened by increasing the climate targets and with a new focus of energy system resilience. So taking a closer look at China's progress, China made carbon peaking before 2030, carbon neutrality before 2060 commitment in 2020. So for the past few years, the progress in energy transition has been accelerated in China. First, from the supply side, we've seen remarkable renewable growth in China. In 2020, the pledge was made, and 2021 is for the first time the policy feed-in tariff was phased out. So the policy for renewables subsidies has been taking place since the renewable energy law since introduced in 2005. So wind, onshore wind, and the centralized solar PV has got cost parity in 2021. So in 2022 last year, for the first time in China's power system, the renewable power capacity surpassed the coal power capacity for the first time. And this year, for the previous 9 months, there was addition for renewable capacity of 170 gigawatts from wind and solar. That was really actually out of expectation by many experts, even within the energy industry. So at the moment, renewable capacity in China reached 1,300 gigawatts and accounts for just about half of the power mix, and it's a third of the global total installed capacity. And the generation of it in China is more than a third as well. So at the moment, in the new installed capacity in China, about 80% is from renewables. So for the supply side, so for the demand side, China for the past years are working on both energy efficiency improvement and fuel switching. So I'm taking transport sector as an example. We can see that the EVs has been growing really fast in China. So by September this year, the stock of new energy vehicles reached over 18 million in China, and majority of them is from pure EVs. So at the same time, the infrastructure for charging is growing very fast. So now we are holding 6.6 million charge piles in China. So averagely it's about 2.5 cars sharing 1 piles in China. So benefiting from this fast growing EV sector, the batteries in China has been growing very fast as well, benefiting the new energy storage, which is majorly from the chemical batteries storage. So what we are seeing is that for the past 5 years, storage is repeating the story as solar PV early years in China. So growing very fast. This year, only the first half of 2023, the additional capacity of new energy storage equals to the total of the additions for the past decade. So there are several opportunities, benefits, like outside the energy system, resulted in this kind of leapfrog energy transition in China. First, in investment, we've seen that last year, 90% of the power source investment are for non-fossil fuels, a little bit higher than what the chair introduced at the beginning of the global average. And secondly, there are green jobs generated. By the end of 2021, there are 2.6 million jobs hired in the wind and solar industry in China. And thirdly, a decoupling of energy growth and economic growth. So for the past 10 years, China's energy growth, demand growth was only 3% per year, but supported a GDP growth more than 6% per year. So, and fourthly, the reduction, a historical reduction of new energy costs. So in China, the installation costs for PV reduced by 80% for the past 13 years, and for wind reduced by 40% for the past 13 years. So this drives down both domestic and global clean energy power price. Like from the ARENA's data, the LCOE, the per kilowatt hour costs of wind reduced by nearly 70% for the past 12 years, and for PV reduced by 90%. And domestically, wind price reduced by 50% in China and 80% in PV power price. So what we are seeing from this trend is that the manufacturing growth in China has both contributed to the global driving down the clean energy costs, but also we are benefiting of this economic of scale of export. So domestically, we can enjoy a lower costs of clean power, which is now reached cost parity for many technologies. So here, but with all this, here we move on to the outlook of towards carbon neutrality. So with all this progress we made for the past decade, we are quite conscious about the challenges we are facing ahead. So for the this is the China energy flow chart. The left-hand side is 2021. So we can see that this in this flow chart, the left-hand side is where how energy is supplied. So by fossil fuels and renewables. Then in the middle is power and heat transformation. In the end, that's end-use sectors like industry, buildings, and transport, and others. So we can see that in 2021, we are still 56% relying on coal, and oil and gas we are relying heavily on importing. So for oil it's over 70%, and for gas it's over 40% of import. So to reach carbon neutrality, we can see this is our scenario result from the right hand side for 2060. The whole picture will be changed. The color on the left, coal will be gone. Instead, the blue and orange are wind and solar. So non-fossil fuels will reach over, from our research, 90% in the energy mix in the supply side. And because we are so heavily relying on renewables, there will be much less efficiency loss in the power sector in the middle. And in the end-use sectors, we can see that the dominant color will be light blue and green, which is electrification and hydrogen. So the hydrogen rate at the moment is 1/5, like 25% in China's end-use sectors. But in 2060, it will be 2/3, like about 66. So, and also will be another 12% in the end-use sectors on green hydrogen. And this green hydrogen will be produced by renewable electricity. So this is a little background of the scenario design we have. So we designed 3 scenarios and based on different paces and assumptions for costs in the energy transition. So the majorly one we recommend is scenario 2, the carbon neutrality scenario, which is digging in the maximum potential of renewables and clean technologies, and the fastest pace to reach zero emissions in energy system before 2055. So what we think is that energy system should realize a early carbon neutrality than the whole society, to make space by some negative emissions to create this space for other hot debate sectors. So this research we're gonna publish and introduce in detail in COP28. So have a closer look at several sectors. So one analysis we did from the scenario research is to see how technologies will grow. And this could be a reference for trade and investment. What we found is that the past decade of fast growth of clean technologies in China is only the beginning. So to reach carbon neutrality, we need unwavering efforts and very fundamental change of the energy system. All sorts of clean technologies will grow even faster and even exponentially. So wind and solar in 2035, as the first stage, will be about 12 times and 6 times of the current level for the next 12 years. And this is the first stage that we rely on traditional renewables. And then after 2035 is when China has reached the carbon peaking. So there will be requirement of even faster and in-depth decarbonization of the energy system. Then there are more new technologies needed. For example, flexibilities. The high proportion of renewables intermittency will require an exponential growth of new energy storage. This is not only batteries, but also because the electrification in the end-use sectors, the electric vehicles will provide a large resource for flexibility in the power system, supported by smart technologies, smart control of the demand side and demand response. And in the end, towards 2060, towards carbon neutrality, there will be large needs for green hydrogen to serve to the hard debate areas. And then the last measure is carbon capture, utilization and storage. But our analysis shows that we can't rely too much on that because it's very expensive at the moment, and also CCS itself is very energy intensive. So we are taking two sectors in the closer look for as an example. For the power sector, our analysis shows that in 2060, under carbon neutrality scenario, the wind and solar will be 9,000 gigawatts in total capacity. That is 12 times what we have now. And they will become the absolute dominant and cheapest technology. So the further cost reduction will happening in wind by a half and in solar by another nearly 70%, making them really the most cost-effective power source. So, and in the end use sector, I'm taking the transport sector as an example here. Well, first, the end use sector, what we are calling this pathway is shift from electrification then to electro-hydrogenation. So you can say that the green hydrogen use will be taking its momentum towards 2060 carbon neutrality, and taking the transport sector as an example for passenger cars. In 2060, there will be 470 million stock of EVs in China, has the potential to provide a V2G smart charging demand-side response as this kind of flexibility is together over 600 gigawatts. I'm putting maritime here because this is highly related to the carbon footprint for trade. So at the moment, Chinese maritime is dominated by fuel oil, but in the carbon neutrality scenario, fuel oil will be reduced to only 5%, and it will be replaced by ammonia, electromethanol, and e-fuel oil, which is also hydrogen-based and renewable power-based. So here are two very small examples, like regional examples that indicate some new trends towards future. The left-hand side is a picture I took several weeks ago in Guangdong province. There's a hydrogen lab in Foshan city. So this is a ceramic tile. The lab calls it the first carbon-free scenario tile produced by ammonia. So previously it was heated because ceramic require really high temperature. It was heated by natural gas, but now they are using ammonia. So you can see all the scientists in the lab signed their signature on that tile. And the right-hand side is what we call green powered by green. That's a PV industry park in Yunnan province, which is GDP worldwide not the highest in China. However, they enjoy a rich hydropower. So now they are having a initiative to use this green power to produce green power facilities to reduce the LCA, the life cycle carbon footprint. So in the end, there are several implications for trade very quickly. So for the what we see from the outlook for China, well, China is only an example, but we share a lot of similarities with the global transition. Some countries leading ahead of us, some countries reach carbon neutrality a little bit behind us, but the pathway suggests that energy transition has a fundamental logic change of guiding by externalities. So this will have two major opportunities for trade. One, trade will be an important engine for affordable, immediate, and inclusive transition by faster dissemination of clean technologies to meet significant increasing demand and lowering the costs for clean technology, especially important for developing countries. And secondly, innovation. Innovation doesn't happen at once, overnight. It has to have its own cycles, follow its own rules based on solid foundation of basic technologies. To offer these technologies will shorten the cycle for innovation and paving the way for breakthroughs. So several challenges we observe, two major ones. One is that there will be coordination of the environmental, economic, and social policies, as mentioned by several speakers. And secondly, we should note that when design policy-related climate measures, there are disparities across nations in terms of development stage, data infrastructure, mitigation responsibilities, and capacity. So I'm taking carbon price mechanism as an example here. So this is World Bank research. Not all the developing countries has carbon price yet. The ones we have the carbon price range from several dollars to over $100. So these are the current uneven situation we are facing. So as a summarize, what we think is that WTO could play and trade policies could play a very important role in three ways. One is for the principles discussion, because a lot of trade and environmental measures are just taking place, new ones. So we are trying to form the consensus by in-depth discussions, especially taking account of the principles, both from the UNFCCC and the WTO, including the common but differentiate responsibilities. And one philosophy could be considered, which is what we call in China, build before breaking, which is that we make constructive way of supporting renewables first, while we try to reform the traditional sector, but that's harder. So from the constructive rather than destructive way to emphasize. And secondly, to facilitate freer flow of clean technologies and to form joint green confidence, especially dynamically and regularly update the environmental friendly goods and services, because as I introduced, along the pathway towards carbon neutrality, the technology composition will be changed. And in the end, emphasize on capacity building like this discussion we're having today, and let every member to speak for their own opinion and enhance the exchange of knowledges. So hopefully trade and energy transition will be the key to form the next era of global joint green confidence. And I look forward to the next discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antti. Again, a very interesting presentation. We heard about the renewable sector in China and China's plans to reach carbon neutrality, kind of a sneak peek before you present this in COP28. That was very interesting, as well as the development of clean energy technologies to enable this, and again, the implications for trade and WTO. So thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there. Next, we will hear from Enya Satren, who is Head of Government Relations and Support Mechanisms at Scatec. Enya has been leading strategic engagement with institutional bodies and political decision makers to attract more renewable energy investments to emerging markets. Prior to her current role, Enya worked for the World Food Programme, the Norwegian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Council of Europe, as well as Plan International. Enya will be joining us online. You have the floor, please. Enya, go ahead.
Thank you. And just checking in, do you all hear me well?
We can hear you. Please Perfect. Go ahead.
And sorry for not being in Geneva. I wish I could be there with you. And sorry also for the very artistic background. I wasn't sure how to shift it on Zoom, but I hope you will bear with me. So maybe just a couple of words about Scatec first, just so you understand sort of what perspective I'm going to be speaking from. So Scatec is a Norwegian company, but a renewable energy IPP that is developing, building, and owning renewable energy projects in emerging markets. So we have close to 5 gigawatts in operation across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Middle East, and a bit in Europe as well. And coming from that sort of perspective of a renewable energy developer investing in projects in emerging markets, I'll try to shed some light on sort of the opportunities and challenges at that intersection between trade and energy transition, and what governments can do more of, and not least in terms of how governments can enable more of that cooperation with third countries to support also Europe's green energy transition, where I think there's a lot of untapped potential to use going forward. So starting in the opportunity space, I think what we are experiencing right now globally is that we are standing in a geopolitical momentum that really accelerates the speed at which the green transition is taking place globally. Right after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the EU launched its most ambitious plans for development of renewable energy and green hydrogen in emerging markets. And I think that is a very clear reflection of the need to build out new energy relations, both from an energy security perspective, but also from a climate perspective, obviously. And I think more than ever, also from a perspective of driving development and stability, which is important in the current geopolitical context, right? I think when the war broke out in Ukraine, my first thought was that, okay, now we're gonna see a lot more isolation, protection of domestic industries, etc. And of course, there's been tendencies of that as well. I mean, especially after the IRA and this race to the top in terms of subsidies in Europe. But I think the overarching response to war and crisis has really been international cooperation. That has been the response, and I think that will also be the legacy that will remain in the years to come. I think there is a very strong realization that sort of the pathway to sustainable Europe is inherently a global one, and that emerging markets have a key, an integral role to play in Europe's green energy transition, and that's where the trade element comes in, right? And this is obviously a huge opportunity for those countries to also drive green industrial growth. And I just wanted to bring forward one example of that, which was also mentioned earlier in terms of green hydrogen and ammonia, which I think is one sector where developments have really accelerated during the past 1 to 2 years, especially after the war in Ukraine. EU has set very ambitious green hydrogen targets, and they depend on attracting imports from emerging markets to namely reach those ambitions, 10 million ton up to 2030 to be specific. And those future hotspot production hubs of green hydrogen, is typically located in Middle East, Northern Africa. Egypt is our focus country for development of green hydrogen, both for domestic decarbonization and export to Europe, right? And I think the reasons for EU to source that's a substantial part of their green hydrogen demand from emerging markets, the reasons for them to do that are even more compelling than ever, right? In the context where Europe is battling a severe energy crisis, I find it difficult to sort of justify the inefficiency losses in converting power to green hydrogen when Europe doesn't even have enough power to decarbonize directly, right? But emerging markets like Egypt are in a quite different position, and they can afford to do both because of abundance of cheap renewable energy resources. Speaking about the green hydrogen cost that was mentioned by EIA earlier, I mean, 80% of the cost of green hydrogen is the cost of renewable energy. So it makes a lot of sense to source it from those countries where the levelized cost of electricity is that low. You have availability of land, and you have a large sector of hard-to-abate sectors that are both willing and needing to decarbonize as the world gears up for net zero. So all of that creates sort of the pillars both for significant CO2 reductions, but also for very attractive business projects for European actors across the green hydrogen value chain. And I would say also an opportunity for EU and Europe to also take a position in these regional green hydrogen markets that are now shaping up. And then I won't say too much more about green hydrogen after this, but just one sort of also messaging in terms of what the governments can do to enable more of this, because we've been seeing a huge potential, right? But there's been very few projects basically going from sort of the drawing board and to the ground. So how do you catalyze more of that potential? Well, the key issue here, right, is that green hydrogen ammonia, that's a product of high political value, but where there is no market, because everybody knows that the price of green hydrogen is expected to drop by 60% by 2030. So from an off-taker perspective, why would you at this point in time take any action to actually start decarbonizing and procure green hydrogen? You might as well wait, right? So the economic incentives of off-takers are naturally skewed towards waiting decarbonization until we reach that price point, which means if we still believe in Repower EU, and if we want to see in Europe and globally a green transition accelerating faster and on a more ambitious timeline than what the market enables, well then, the key priority needs to be to put in public muscles, institutional muscles into creating that market through attacking the current market barriers, such as compensating the price difference between green and grey, and securing long-term offtake. So that is just one example of how we can enable that. So second sort of opportunity area I wanted to highlight is obviously the significant demand growth in renewable energy to cater to growing energy needs, and we're going to need a range of different technologies applied to different country needs going forward. I think what is also interesting to highlight, in terms of the development of the renewable energy potential globally, is also the evolvement we've been seeing in terms of rollout of more dispatchable renewable energy. That has been the typical sort of counter arguments against renewables, that it's intermittent power source and it cannot provide that stability and flexibility that gas and fossil fuels can do, right? But that has completely changed when you're now able to deliver dispatchable renewable energy through solutions like PV and battery, etc. And I just want to highlight one project which I think goes a long way in terms of showing how competitive dispatchable renewables are in today's markets. We are currently busy finalizing a huge project in South Africa. It's the continent's biggest hybrid installation. I just went to visit it the other week, and we're speaking 10 kilometers of solar panels, more than 1 million solar panels, and it's a project that was won in a technology agnostic tender, right? Meaning that it was out competing other fossil fuels alternatives. So that says a lot about both the cost competitiveness of dispatchable renewables, but also, the feasibility of implementing it at this stage, and the positive impact on the national level. This tender was a response to the current electricity crisis in South Africa, which shows that you now have fully renewable solutions that are able to actually respond to urgent energy needs, and it's no longer any conflict between sort of covering urgent energy needs and supporting the green transition. You can do both through the technology evolvements we've been seeing on the renewable side during the past years. The trade element to why I'm mentioning these projects is that I think these flagship projects that we're seeing across emerging markets now, these mega projects, the interesting component here is also how this can help support sort of broader development in that region, especially with the development of these sort of liberalized power pools at the regional level that we're seeing both in Southern Africa and also in Western Africa, meaning that more developed economies like Botswana, South Africa can then also help bring energy to the wider region and support less developed countries in the region through these liberalized power pools. It will also reduce kind of the need for guarantees, etc., because you have a wider sort of offtake pool to choose from, right? So I think that is also initiatives that the WTO should also support and help strengthen. Another component to that is obviously that you would need to build out significant investments in terms of infrastructure, both in terms of transmission and grid, to actually have the infrastructure that can enable a more sort of liberalized energy trading across the region. So now I've been sort of painting a bit of a rosy picture of all of the opportunities and the green shift, but I want to finish up by saying a few words about the challenges, because what we are seeing, right, is that there is a huge untapped potential for renewable energy in emerging markets, not least in Africa. Africa has 60% of the global solar potential, but only attracting less than 2% of the world's FDIs in renewables. There's nowhere in the world where there's such a big gap between the potential and realized projects on the other side. So what is the key reason for that? Well, I would say the single most important reason for such a gap is the cost of capital and the lack of available financing for projects in countries with higher risks, but equally higher rewards, both from a climate perspective and from a development perspective. And that is because a lot of the financing in the market is sort of catalyzed or canalized towards already bankable projects. And I think bankable is a really important distinction, because there's a lot of talk about, you know, the financing needs and how much money it's going to take to light up Africa, etc. But, you know, the reason that we are not seeing enough renewable energy investment in those countries, it's not a lack of financing as such. The problem is lack of capital to the projects that actually that don't have sort of already a risk allocated framework, that are not backed up by state guarantees. I mean, there's a lot of bankable projects that capital forces are queuing up to finance, right? But what we need to fix are those projects in countries with a higher need for more investments, but where we see that you don't have sufficient sort of risk reduction instruments around them, and they cannot be guaranteed, right? Which goes to show that there's a strong development dimension here, right? It is in relative terms more expensive for a developing country to actually invest in renewable energy, because that state guarantee that could have been used to guarantee for that renewable energy investment might as well have been used to cover other important needs, such as building of a hospital or a school, right? So that development dimension is really remarkable, and that the result of that dynamic is that investments are not going where we need them to, both from a climate perspective and a development perspective. So how do we address that? And I have three sort of main points for you. Number one is that we need to address the gaps in the current guarantee market that I was alluding to earlier. There's a big gap in available guarantee products, especially for like smaller distributed solutions that will play a major role in Africa's green energy transition. And I think my key message there, because this is something that needs to be led by the governments, by guarantee institutions, also supported by technical bodies and institutions like WTO. The key point is then to make guarantee products that are additional, meaning that they need to cover risks that are not today sufficiently covered in the market, so that you actually can enable more projects than what the current market enables today, right? So there's a lot of talks about guarantees, a lot of allocations going to these guarantee institutions, but what we really need to do is to have a proper look at, you know, what risks are not sufficiently covered in the current guarantee market, how can I fill those gaps? And I think, for instance, what is happening actually in Norway now, the development of a state guarantee mechanism that is backed with the Norwegian state's balance sheet, that is very effective, because then you can actually really get some traction on investment. So looking forward to follow that back in Norway. Number two, I think there's a lot to do just in terms of the functioning of a lot of these big DFIs operating as a lender for most investments in emerging markets. They tend to be very bureaucratic and it's big bureaucratic animals with a quite high level of risk aversion. I often hear certain sort of DFI representatives kind of bragging that they've never lost a penny on any of their investments. And then I'm a bit like, if your mandate is to drive renewable energy investments in an emerging market, and you are DFI and you've never lost any money on your investments, then I would say that you haven't taken enough risk, right? So I think that is also, it's a question of mandate when you are investing in renewable energy with donor funds. I mean, your mandate is not to get a AAA rating on your investment, is really to drive development and drive more green energy projects, right? Thirdly, the investment climate in itself can be a challenge to realize more projects, right? Because you are navigating a terrain with higher political, regulatory risk, low visibility on market potential, etc. All of those kind of elements, they lead to the fact that you as a developer spend quite a lot of time and money already in the development phase of renewable energy projects without any certainty around how long it will take to actually reach an investment decision or whether you will ever succeed, right? And I think that is kind of the phase where a lot of developers fall out and projects fall through, right? So whatever you can do in terms of mitigating and reducing risks in that development phase of projects, that makes a lot of sense to catalyze more investments. in the short run, that's, could be a question of, development cost support, feasibility studies, technical assistance, etc. But I think in the longer run, and the more sort of important response to that is, to work. Host governments themselves have the main mandate, right, to strengthen institutions, improve, framework conditions, and that are more supportive in terms of a business environment. But I think there's also a role for donor governments and institutions like WTO to actually also support governments in creating those framework conditions. And here I would say that these kind of sort of investments in building more stronger and transparent institutions and processes, these are investments that go way beyond, attracting more renewable energy investments, but it goes to show, how enabling an environment that is more attractive for investment also is an investment in strengthening kind of the overall sort of functioning of institutions and creating a well-functioning structure in general, which I think should be at the core of the WTO's mandate. But I'll stop there, and looking forward to hear the rest of your interventions. It's been really good to listen to you guys already. So looking forward to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Enya, very much. A great job. And thank you also for presenting us with the artistic background. It was great to hear from a European perspective of a European business operating globally. Thank you for highlighting some of the projects, green hydrogen, dispatchable renewable energy, and how renewables can support development objectives. Thank you also for highlighting the element of transmission infrastructure, and for highlighting also the huge gap in the needs in developing countries and investments, and what might be the reasons and what could be done to address this. Thank you, Enya. Let me now turn to our final speaker, Mr. James Irungu Mwangi, CEO of Africa Climate Ventures. James is also the founder of the Climate Action Platform for Africa to help unlock Africa's potential to transform its economies while playing a leading role in effective climate action. Before this, James has helped found the Dalberg Group, and in 20 years of James' career has led the firm's expansion into Africa and served as a global managing partner of Dalberg Advisors, and finally as executive director of the Dalberg Group. So James, based on your experience in the private sector, what are the main trade-related opportunities and challenges that energy transition brings for Africa? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anna. And am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you, Anna, for the kind introduction. It's both intimidating and very helpful to go last after some very knowledgeable and informative presentations. I'll be able to hopefully build on some of what they have already covered. And the first thing to say is really picking up on what you said, which is where I want to anchor my conversation or my remarks to kick off, to feed into this conversation, is on the idea of Africa's comparative advantage. And really the developing worlds, really to Andres's points earlier, because I think some of the things I said he talked about with regard to Latin America really apply to Africa as well. That untapped comparative advantage in helping the world accelerate its progress towards net zero or carbon neutral outcomes going forward. As was said, I now run a venture company called Africa Climate Ventures, and we're dedicated to this idea that Africa has this major comparative advantage across 3 areas that are really human imperatives if we're to avoid climate catastrophe. As humanity, we now need, and it's very clear from the IPCC, we need to protect our existing carbon sinks. We need to green every aspect of production and consumption. And we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere at massive scale over the remainder of this century. These are 3 equally important, massive tasks ahead of us. And for each of them, I think we need to be thinking about the trade, the global trade ecosystem and structures in the context of how do they enable these 3 areas to be done in the way that is most efficient and most generative of broad-based prosperity for the planet. these aren't side issues. They become increasingly the critical imperatives for our global trade, business, and production systems. Now, in terms of what we do at Africa Climate Ventures, we're really looking at across all of these three areas, and I'll give three examples before I jump into my specific remarks. When you think about protecting carbon sinks, in Africa, the biggest danger to carbon sinks and really the biggest driver of Africa's emissions today is deforestation, the biggest driver of which is biomass for cooking. And so solutions that pivot African households away from unprocessed, low-efficiency biomass towards clean cooking solutions are one of the biggest ways to protect carbon sinks. So we are invested in one of the continent's fastest growing clean cooking solutions, essentially pivoting over 1 million households in the last year and a half to bioethanol-powered cooking, with a target of reaching between 40 and 50 million households over the next decade. The second area, and that already is generating something on the order of 5 million tons of avoided emissions or avoided deforestation benefit every year. When you talk about green consumption, you're really talking about how do you green industry and how do you really electrify everything and green electrical supply. And there we're looking at developing green industrial parks that take advantage of that 60%. And was fantastic in really centering that number. That 60% of the world's untapped renewable solar. And about 40% of once you do a blended breakdown of all of the renewable resources, it ends up being about 40% of the world's best renewable resources are in Africa, with less than 2% of the world's renewable investment. So we're developing green industrial parks to attract particular industries, one of which, tying to the last point around removing carbon, one of those industries is carbon removal, and looking at sectors such as direct air capture, energy-intensive sectors that will need to scale up over time and need to begin that journey towards scaling up in places where there is sufficient, abundant, untapped renewable energy and other enabling conditions. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the kinds of things that we're looking at that step away from merely looking at how do you address Africa's energy poverty and the role of Africa as a climate victim, and begin to look at how African countries and African markets can be really competitive in addressing various aspects of the climate imperative. So let's come back to the question of energy poverty and energy access, that 60% versus 2% number that has already been brought to the fore. A lot of the conversation tends to be about how do we drive renewables, how do we drive investment into renewables? How do we, in other words, make it possible to invest in energy supply? However, I would argue that it's also worth this group here and this community here applying itself to the other side of that question, which is that the breakdown in global energy markets in terms of tapping renewable energy is driven as much, if not more, by how we think about where we put energy demand. So where is it that we're putting the world's most energy hungry, most high energy demand industrial activity, and how do the rules of global trade for the remainder of this century move us towards a more aligned, a more climate aligned set of strategies? So specifically, what are we trying to solve for? We're trying to solve for bankable offtake. Right? You heard the question of how do we get to bankability of energy projects. I would argue that the idea here is you identify bankable users of energy and you get them to go where the energy is. Because a fundamental reality is that renewable energy is hard to move. Where it exists in abundance, but it is hard to move. You take huge efficiency losses in transforming it into green hydrogen or green ammonia and shipping it and then burning it again. If you do long distance transmission, you start to run into a whole set of other issues, both geopolitical and physical. It's just easier, as much as possible, to use the energy where the energy is. Now, renewable energy is unevenly distributed. The developing world, for the most part, has a superabundance that is more than 1,000 times current energy demand of renewable energy potential. That's true of most of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Right? And it's heavily concentrated, it's unevenly distributed and heavily concentrated in developing countries. So you already heard about the 60%, but you saw in Anchi's presentation what kinds of opportunities that can open up at a national level. She talked about Yunnan becoming a hub for green production because it was a low economic productivity area that happened to be in close proximity to a renewable energy resource. Now, if we apply that logic, not just at a national level, but at a global level, it might tell you something about where we may want to think about moving production or doing new production. Now, a shift in a purely economically rational, logical space, a shift towards renewables should equate to a huge comparative and competitive advantage for industries based in places like Africa. So I was struck by the fact that the IEA presentation highlighted a lot of the potential advantages as green hydrogen, for example, moves into competitiveness. But you'll notice geographically, it did not include Africa, in part because energy in Africa today is expensive, largely for the financing issues that were laid out. If you think about the pure geophysical and engineering questions, renewable energy in Africa should be the cheapest in the world, in part because there's no competing use for it, really. So again, let's think about how do we begin to apply ourselves to this question of unlocking this available energy for use cases like hydrogen, but going beyond that as well. So if energy access is the binding constraint and it's framed as a finance question, how does trade solve it? It solves it by making clear the demand signal that says the more you can reduce the emissions intensity of production, the more attractive you should be as a production hub. And this is where I think that we are thinking currently, developing countries are thinking a little bit too narrowly about CBAMs. Today, we are very anchored in the near-term effects of CBAMs on current carbon intensity of production, or in the dangers that poorly designed CBAMs pose towards producers, particularly small business in developing countries that will not have the wherewithal to comply with the data requirements or to properly document their climate advantage. We're, in a sense, looking at CBAMs from the perspective of how do we avoid losing, and that makes sense. However, and I think Andres already alluded to this, any actual fact-based and accurately applied mechanism that drives production to the places that have the lowest carbon intensity of production cannot help, given where the renewable energy resources are, cannot help but also be a push towards moving the marginal unit of production towards developing countries. I usually say Africa, but it's equally true of Latin America because that is where the largest proportion of untapped renewables are. So how do we suddenly look at CBAM, not from the perspective of how do we prevent developing countries losing, but how do we design CBAMs that promote global justice, promote climate equity, and also accelerate our path to carbon neutrality, not just by shifting the energy mix of production where production is today, but by also shifting the geographic mix of where we anchor particular emissions and energy-intensive aspects of production. So trade, not just as an enabler of decarbonization, but as a major accelerant of decarbonization and development. Now, let me use an illustrative example. There was the point has been made before about the increasing attention being paid to the future of green hydrogen. 10 million tons of green hydrogen imports in Europe by the end of this decade, for example. That's translating to a number of projects that begin to highlight this, but I want to actually talk about them talk about one example in a few layers. Right? So the first conversation begins with, well, we can do green hydrogen. Where do we have the best renewable energy resources? Namibia puts its hand up and says, we are an ideal location. We've got a huge coastline, very high quality solar, some high quality offshore wind off the southern coast of Africa. We should be a highly scalable player in green hydrogen. That is correct. And there's a number of conversations underway now around how do you begin to invest in that. However, what is one of the biggest and most urgent uses of green hydrogen? It is in green steel production. And so the current plan, the initial plan, essentially was saying this is a location, and the assumption today is Africa will supply the hydrogen will go to where the iron ore is, and will be used in existing steel-making hubs to make green steel. Except, wait a minute. One of the world's largest exporters of iron ore is South Africa, which is right next to the Namibian green hydrogen projects. And so a few weeks ago, you had ArcelorMittal actually put the two pieces together and say, well, why don't we experiment with green steel production here? Now, a CBAM that nudged countries to do more of that allows us to skip the energy inefficient process of pressurizing, depressurizing hydrogen, and instead think about how do we allocate the different steps of industrial processes for the maximum efficiency and maximum benefit, keeping in mind that for countries that do have a limit to their ability to generate renewable energy, we actually don't want to be forcing production to those places above and beyond what they can carry. So that's a journey from, well, how do we finance a renewable energy project, to, yes, we do it with green hydrogen, maybe green ammonia, to, wait a second, you can do complex industrial production of green steel. Now, the next question you'd run into after that is, if you've got green steel, you've got lots of renewable energy, and you've got lots of labor, because this is the youngest continent, might we want to do some more manufacturing than the current 4 or 5% of global manufacturing in these very same places? Perhaps. So this is one illustrative example of an energy-intensive industrial sector that could benefit from a new thinking around how do trade mechanisms and trade barriers and trade enablers really feed into driving towards the best climate outcome. A few other examples just to show that it's not just one area. If the only change you made, so today 25% of the world's bauxite, which is the precursor to aluminum, comes from Guinea in West Africa, more or less. Comes from Guinea in West Africa. Virtually none of it is processed in Africa. And yet West Africa, like indeed most of Africa, has a superabundance of available renewable energy that is untapped. The reason it is untapped is that there is no bankable off-taker for that energy. If the only change you made was to shift aluminum smelting, a highly energy intensive, but actually, not massively value-adding industrial sector, shift the processing of Africa's bauxite to Africa to translate into 44 gigawatts of new power, tens of billions of dollars of investment, and at least by our analysis, 250,000 jobs to begin with as an injection. It would also, in case you're not particularly interested in Africa's development prospects and outcomes, it would also reduce global carbon emissions by between 300 and 400 million tons a year. That's 1% of global industrial emissions annually. Without a single new technological innovation, while reducing the cost of shipping, because suddenly you're not carrying a whole bunch of other precursors halfway around the world for smelting. It's a win-win-win, and with massive imports of renewable energy infrastructure from those who are manufacturing them. It's a true win-win-win for the planet, for community, for the region. Look at data centers. Where are we putting, as AI begins to become a major demand driver, where are we putting energy-hungry data centers today? And what would it mean to shift as much of that kind of energy-intensive service to places in the world where you can use up renewable energy with no concern about hitting an upper limit? Let's think about shipping. As we're thinking about the transition to green shipping fuels, e-methanol, green ammonia, etc., where do we want to put that infrastructure? One solution is that we ship green hydrogen to major ports in the global north. Another solution is that you take places like the Suez Canal. You look at areas like the Red Sea, ports like Djibouti, where you have massive amounts of wind and geothermal and solar potential, and actually make those e-methanol hubs. Lots of the world's shipping is going through there anyway. Might as well build a gas station there. And then let's get to carbon removal, which I already touched on earlier. If you're thinking about industries like direct air capture, which requires massive amounts of electricity or thermal energy to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and then hopefully sequester it underground, where should the balance of that industry be? In close proximity to countries that are already active emitters, such that every unit of renewable energy you use to drag down carbon from the atmosphere should have been used to actually reduce the amount of carbon you're emitting from your gas and your coal. Or in places like Kenya, which has a 92% renewable grid today, and is barely scratching the surface, is barely tapping 1% of its renewable energy potential, and has exactly the same geological conditions for enabling long-term durable carbon storage as Iceland does, which is the current hub of that industry. And how do we create the mechanisms to incentivize that? So in a sense, I love the point that was made earlier, build before you break. The good news for the world is that there are parts of the world, for very bad reasons, where there's nothing to break. And we just need to build. And if you're thinking about, and if we're thinking about what a global transition to a low carbon economy looks like, I would argue to this group that the role of Africa today is vastly understated by virtue of limiting the discussion of Africa to Africa's problems and limitations, rather than the massive resources it can bring to global decarbonization. To unlock this, I would propose a couple of things. One is we need to move away from static analyses in general. Right? The numbers we saw in terms of the trajectory of the cost of renewable energy, in terms of the adoption rates and so on, that needs to be factored into our thinking. A static analysis of CBAMs has us thinking about the limited amount of existing African industry that will be disadvantaged by CBAMs poorly applied. A dynamic analysis would ask, what does it do to Africa's role as the undisputed loser in terms of attracting global foreign direct investment today? How would a well-applied set of CBAMs actually shift that by attracting investment to places in the world that can actually grow while boosting the world's overall performance against its climate targets? The second thing I'd look at is really ensuring that the way these policies are being designed, like the CBAMs, is data-driven and granularly data-driven. There's nothing more dangerous than vague assumptions in the game of figuring out which places should be advantaged as hubs of production. So are we investing enough in ensuring that we have the right metrics for assessing what level of barrier is being applied? Are we being granular enough in ensuring that any trade barrier that is ostensibly about boosting progress towards decarbonization is actually really assessing and attesting to the level of carbon intensity of production? And to the extent that the reason a country or location cannot participate because of a lack of investment in rigorous data, are we creating the mechanism for the relatively modest investment that would get us that data? Because in a sense, we're leaving our best locations. Remember, the best locations in the world, by and large, for energy-intensive activity are in the developing world where the data is poorest. We're leaving trillions of dollars of decarbonization value on the table for want of a few $100 million in improving the sources and quality of data. There's a question on how we channel revenue from mechanisms like a CBAM in a world where the world has, at a time when the rest of the world is clearly not on track to meet obligations such as the $100 billion flowing to developing countries, which is itself a fraction of the amount that's needed. Rethinking these mechanisms so that you're using this revenue to actually boost the readiness of countries to actually participate in the green transition, rather than just having them as an additional fiscal stimulus or as an additional fiscal input to the countries that are levying them, could end up again creating a win-win-win from the application of these kinds of tools. And finally, we need rules and we need some thinking around how will we actually trade durable carbon removal. It is a crucial part of any equation that gets us to net zero by 2050 or even beyond. It is one that will require us to identify the best places in the world to do carbon removal at scale. And yet it's an intangible export in which a lot of the thinking is still very, very nascent. A sector which, again, I call your attention to the IPCC report, will need to be trading the removals or managing removals of between 5 and 15 billion tons per annum. It will be the single largest transaction of material on planet Earth by 2050, and yet we are completely silent on how that will be governed and how it will be incentivized to ensure that it is being done in the most efficient and effective way for the planet. So with those areas of challenge and question. Of course, I speak about these in some ways as a self-interested investor. These are areas that I am either active in or looking to deploy in, but I think others are as well. So this is not just pie in the sky. These are active opportunities, but looking forward to hopefully seeing further traction about these and moving Africa from being just a climate victim to recognizing its potential to be a critical part of the climate vanguard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for a very inspiring presentation. I like how you highlight Africa's comparative advantage in renewables and how this could link to energy-intensive production and industrial processes. So this is really another perspective on reducing carbon emissions. You shared very interesting examples as well as suggestions for the way forward. So thank you very much for a great contribution. Thank you to the whole panel for your excellent interventions. A lot of food for thought here. Before opening the floor to the members, I would just like to give each panelist a very brief, only 2-minute opportunity to briefly react to the other presentations or make additional remarks. So Araceli, please, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Very insightful presentations and speeches. I just wanted to make a point about how we could disentangle this complex issue of all these synergies between trade and clean energy transition in particular. So my suggestion, I mean, for the offering of, more food for thought for the discussion is to think about this in two key buckets. The first one, I think, is about, how we could accelerate the deployment of those technologies that are already on the market, that are clearly differentiated for conventional incumbents. We think about PV, batteries, winds, heat pumps, etc., and that they are already having an important inertia in terms of deployment. At the same time, they are already actually cost effective in quite a few regional contexts. So to me, I think we've been discussing a little bit on the kind of key de-risking mechanisms here, focusing more on how we can make bankable projects, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies, so that we kind of spread this inertia that we're seeing in advanced economies to those regions. I think there is a clear action that could be taken in that kind of range of technologies. The second group to me is those areas that need to be decarbonized in the system. We are not talking about new commodities. We are talking about new technologies to produce those commodities. The example is steel, aluminum, chemicals, different materials. The example is as well about, how we can decarbonize the production of different fuels that could be more used in the future, as hydrogen has been mentioned already. So here, the challenge is different. Here, the challenge is how we can make technologies that can really meet this environmental performance to the market. They are not already at the market at scale. So how we can go over this valley of death in a way that, could be successful. So we need differentiation. The commodities, the final commodities that will reach the markets could be exactly the same. The hydrogen molecule will be the same. The kilo or the ton of steel will be the same, but they will be produced through different routes. And those routes at the moment are more costly. So we need to create mechanisms that can clearly differentiate these production routes in a way that is fair, that is transparent, and again, that is compatible with our climate objectives. And even beyond, as we saw that we need to raise ambition. Here, for me, the risking challenge is different. We need to work on definitions, on standards, as has been mentioned as well. And I think we have a clear path there on how we could, collaborate in this space. And I think this could really help unveiling what are the most optimal, let's say, locations for production first to develop and then to test and then to deploy this type of technologies, as has been highlighted by my colleagues, looking at, high potential regions in Latin America, high potential regions in Africa. So to me, I think it would be quite helpful to make this distinction in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And Andres, you have 2 minutes. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. Just one comment and one thought of something that I didn't mention in the presentation, but I think it's critical. I'll start with this one. What James was arguing for the potential of Africa and the potential for Latin American countries to participate in the green transition. Another aspect related to trade that we need to take into account is the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and how this ISDS could actually slow down the possibility of countries participating in the green transition. What do I mean by that? is that a lot of countries, both in Latin America and in Africa, have made huge deals and investments from the private sector on traditional fossil fuels projects. Now that countries are embracing the green agenda and transitioning to renewables, we will probably see an increase in the demands and the disputes from those investments that were done 15, 20, even 30 years ago, that will try to get more resources out of the already lacking resources from government. So a whole debate around ISDS and how this mechanism is set up has to be had, recognizing that for countries to meet their climate ambitions, they will have to change some of the decisions that were made 20, 30 years ago around a fossil fuel dependent path. So ISDS. And the second point that I just wanted to raise very quickly has to do with subsidies, which I don't think was highly discussed here, but I think at the WTO, the discussion around subsidies for fisheries, agriculture, and fossil fuels is also an example of an area that won't be solved exclusively from the WTO, and that actually requires working groups with environmental organizations, UNFCCC, and NGOs that can really provide a broader understanding of the impact of those subsidies, not only that are trade distorting, but that are actually historically not capture the full impact on environment. And when we take those into account, the case for the potential of renewables in Africa and Latin America and other developing countries becomes even bigger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Auntie, your 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the very fruitful discussions. I have 3 comments actually inspired by the previous speakers. First one is CBAM. A lot of speakers mentioned this. So CBAM is first of its kind of cross-border carbon adjustment, but it won't be the last. So we've seen that international organizations like IMF initiatives for floor prices for carbon, and also World Bank has their own initiatives, and there are, like under the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, there are cross-border carbon trading system, etc. So a lot of initiatives are taking place. So what we would suggest is that because this is a new era guided by externalities, so under the WTO platform, it's very important to have a structural, in-depth discussion of the fundamentals of this kind of initiatives. It's not only the result of discussions, it's the process that we look at these problems. For example, if it's justified to link the domestic or internal market carbon price to external other countries, if the burden on carbon price on developing countries be conflict with their own development goals. So if there are other better alternatives to solve carbon leakage, if the efficiency of carbon leakage is well, mostly effective solution would be CBAM, etc. So this kind of questions, the asking and answer will allow us to have a improvement on understanding of formation of the next stage of this carbon pricing measures global-wise. So, and the second comment is about a very inspiring comment from James about the reallocation of green industry to the source region of the world. And I just I very much agree with this, and I think that brings a bright future. Just would like to add on this, it's not only about trade or investment for green energy in Africa, it's also about the knowledge, technologies associated. Is a systematic reallocation of industry. For example, data centers, we had this analysis within China. So it's not only the rich and cheap green power, it's also the technicians to operate data centers, the technologies associated with that. And this knowledge, this kind of services, goods needs to be traded or invested as a package rather than only one element, and that can best help the inclusive development of the whole world, and unlock the leapfrog opportunities for Africa. And the third comment is about how we look at diversity. So when we look at China here, it's one country, but domestically it's 31 provinces and autonomous regions. So when we see, well, China has large proportion of the PV industry, etc., but domestically we see thousands of companies. They fight through competitions to their current position, and I've been having the chance to talk to several of them, many of them, and they are true entrepreneurs. So a lot of companies go and come and go. That's well, very, very intensive competition happening in the renewable industry. And also these companies now following the ESGs through the multilateral companies, so they are improving their production standards, etc. So what I would like to say is that trade under WTO has the as long as it follows the international principles, laws, justified competition. So we should try to facilitate freer flow of clean technologies and offer the best possible, cheapest possible technologies to unlock further innovation that is needed for immediate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Enya, you have 2 minutes, please, online.
Sure. Thanks. No, I'll be brief. Just a couple of comments from my side to what the others were saying. First of all, I think the presentation from EIA on supply chains was interesting. I think supply chains now has sort of become a question. It's been really, supply chains has become geopolitics, right? It's a question of security control, and it's a bit like every country is sort of trying to secure all of the supply chains within their own domestic jurisdiction, right? And I'm not sure if that is the most efficient way to go forward. Rather, I think we need to have a bit more of a holistic approach to what makes sense, what's part of the value chain, does it make sense to roll out in different countries, and based on where you actually have a competitive advantage, which should be sort of common sense, right? But I think in the current dynamic, we have kind of like we're moving a bit away from that. So I think it's always good to get analysis from EIA that kind of again reflects that point of how we can look at this from a more global perspective. And I would say the same point goes also towards how we are thinking about how we are rolling out different renewable energy technologies in different countries, and where we should spearhead different types of climate solutions. Again, I mean, it goes back to what several of us were alluding to, the big untapped potential in emerging markets, not least in Latin America and Africa, for big renewable energy investments. I think coming from a Norwegian perspective, I can often get a bit of a fatigue around kind of how we are fighting in Norway, discussing onshore, offshore wind projects, and it's so difficult, right? And I'm like, guys, we have a lot of capital that we could deploy in the countries where you have the highest technical potential to really drive these technologies going forward, and where you can also drive green industrial growth in those countries. And I think that is kind of the perspective we need to have, where can we use sort of financing and de-risking instruments in the most effective way for the greater good. And I would say even the fact that we have sort of national climate reviews instead of actually having, finding a better way of actually accounting for how we can enable investments also outside of our own jurisdiction. I think that would be helpful, but that it's not something that I think we can solve during today's session. But that was one. Second, I also just wanted to comment on CBAM, because I thought it was interesting to sort of listen to those discussions. CBAM is obviously something from our perspective that we have been sort of waiting for, and it's a good example of a market enabler that can help make green hydrogen ammonia a bit more cost competitive in the EU. And we were even sort of, we have been hoping it to be more ambitious and with a timeline that is a bit faster, etc. But I do agree on this point of like how CBAM is formulated with a quite a big distance from sort of the markets and countries that it will impact. And I think that goes also for a lot of the other EU directives that is now being formulated, and the regulations surrounding green hydrogen specifically that I'm following closely, you often see a big disconnect between what is sort of formulated in Brussels and what makes sense in the countries of production. And it comes across often as, and now I'm speaking again EU perspective, but that the EU has a lot of different competing political objectives at the same time, right? They, if you take green hydrogen as example, they want to have green hydrogen really fast imported to Europe. They want to have it cheap, and they want to have it environmentally friendly and perfect from first phase. And it needs to be in line with EU regulations that are both that are still under development, right? In countries that don't necessarily have the same frameworks to implement those standards. And I think there is a big gap there. And maybe this is also an area where organizations like WTO could come in and kind of be a bit of that translator between what's happening in these regulatory directives and how you can actually make this function on the ground and tighten a bit that gap. Yeah, that'd be my 2 comments. And then
thank you very much, Enya. Last but not least, James, you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I had tried to sprinkle some reactions to everyone else in my earlier comments, but I'll add a few things. It was interesting, just picking up on what was just said earlier. I was talking to Ricardo Hausmann a few weeks ago, and he made a very powerful point that I think ties to something that was said here and is worth bearing in mind. We've fallen into this idea that each country is thinking about how they themselves can get to net zero as a country, whereas actually each country should be asking how can they make their biggest possible contribution to net zero. Those 2 things are not the same thing. And indeed, the whole idea of global trade has shown us that those 2 things are almost never the same thing in anything you're trying to optimize for. And so there's a need for the global trade community to assert itself a little bit in the fundamental framing of how we're thinking about getting to net zero, because we're thinking about net zero in a kind of trade illiterate way as of right now. Second thing, I very much share the concern about dispute resolution and so on. I'll make it very tangible. One of the biggest barriers to Kenya decarbonizing our energy system is DFI-funded fossil fuel energy projects on the grid that the government is being stopped from renegotiating, even though those very same countries are saying, well, we are very much in favor of a green transition. And Kenya is a relatively light case because we have a relatively modest fleet. This is one of the biggest questions out there right now, is how do you deal with contradictory impulses and contradictory guidance, where the developing world in particular would love nothing better than to go to its comparative advantage in renewable energy, but is signed on to covenants and agreements that limit that transition. That ties to maybe another note to make is, how do we interpret the principle of common but differentiated responsibility given the change in the overall context, right? When it was first written out in global climate agreements, it was really about who would take the economic hit to decarbonize. As we've now heard, and as the data is clearly showing, increasingly decarbonizing is not about who takes a hit, right? There's going to be new industries, new sectors, and indeed, as you can see, new competition to enter those sectors. But the principle of common and differentiated responsibility shouldn't go away. It should just be interpreted in a different way to say, how do we make sure that those who have contributed the least to the problem and could potentially contribute the most to the solution are in a position to benefit from their positioning in a way that is in line with climate justice and overall fair treatment, versus what was a previous question of how do we excuse them from needing to cut their emissions as fast as others. Maybe the last thing to note is I think a very powerful point around the fact that you can't just move. An industry isn't just energy. It isn't just a plant. It's also expertise. The other major shift I would maybe like to underline is we're in a transition that I don't know if we fully internalized, which is from a globe in which energy was easy to move. So fossil fuels are tremendously easy to move because they're so energy dense and largely stable. Energy was easy to move, and knowledge, expertise, and experience were difficult to move. You needed to actually get the expert to go from place A to place B in order for that expertise to be available to some other team. we're now in a world where expertise can move seamlessly. We can Zoom call to anywhere in the world. AI can carry a set of expert tasks anywhere it needs to go. So expertise can now move almost at zero marginal cost. And energy, particularly green energy, is hard to move. What might that do to the distribution of where we choose to put various types of activity, and what things we think of as binding locations to being the ideal locations for an activity versus others? Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you to the whole panel again for your very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Wow, we have a lot of issues on the table, a broad range of issues related to trade and energy transition and climate. And some are within the realm of what we as WTO members can do here and are doing and discussing here. And others are, of course, broader, that will require some other stakeholders and international organizations' inputs as well. With this, I'd like to open the floor to members for your comments and questions. Please keep your remarks brief and to the point, and please specify also which panelist or which panelists you would like to address your questions to. If you're participating on Zoom, please just raise your hand, and if you have technical difficulties, you may also write your question or comment in the Q&A section, and the Secretariat will help us read it out. So with this, I'd like to maybe take a few comments first and then allow the panel to respond. The floor is open. We've had such a comprehensive panel that Is Spain online, to be followed by Canada? Let's take Canada first.
Thank you very much. I make this intervention on behalf of Costa Rica and Canada in our capacity as co-conveners of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structure Discussions, TESTI. Since its launch in 2021, the 75 members participating in the TESTI have sought to complement the work of the Committee on Trade and Environment and other WTO bodies. I would like to take this opportunity now to share some of the insights on the discussions within TESTI in relation to the topic of this thematic session. Renewable energy has been a cross-cutting topic across the 4 informal groups in the TESTI. I will highlight some of the linkages in those discussions, many of which relate very well to the points made by the presenters today. I should stress that what I'm about to report are points raised in the discussion and not negotiated or consensus outcomes. In the Working Group on Trade-related Climate Measures, members have been reviewing carbon measurement standards and decarbonization measures in several key sectors, such as iron and steel, fertilizers, and aluminium. Members identified the need for alignment, coordination, and coherence of technical regulations and standards so as to enable interoperability and prevent the fragmented approaches which result in additional barriers to trade. The development of international carbon emission standards can help with the identification of emission hotspots and the consequent decarbonization of the most polluting sectors. The Informal Working Group on Environmental Goods and Services, too, has had discussions relevant to the energy transition, particularly through its focus on the renewable energy sector. A key contribution of this working group is the work done towards identification of the goods and services important for solar, wind, and hydro energy and their supply chains. Developing country perspectives, barriers, and bottlenecks to dissemination of environmental goods and services have been discussed, as well as opportunities to overcome them. For instance, trade facilitation measures to streamline the movement of goods, cooperation on technical regulations, and mutual recognition of standards, good regulatory practices for licensing and authorizing procedures, as well as improving regulatory transparency related to renewable energy services, have been identified as some of the ways to aid the dissemination of goods and services relevant to the renewable energy sector. In the Informal Working Group on Subsidies, members have engaged in a rich experience sharing regarding subsidies relating to the transition to a low carbon economy. Here, members emphasized the importance of consistency with WTO rules in designing subsidies, as well as of the transparency in supporting greater predictability and greener economies. The need to improve compliance with notification requirements under the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures was made. Other points made include deploying subsidies alongside regulatory measures to incentivize private investment in key sectors to the energy transition, and undertaking a proportional and targeted approach to minimizing trade distortive impacts. Lastly, the informal working group on circular economy has addressed the trade aspects of the solar and wind energy sectors through the perspective of circularity of goods essential to these sectors. The energy transition will lead to an increase in the volume of such goods being traded, and therefore measures to promote circularity will become increasingly important. These can include encouraging reuse, repair, and recycling, reducing input materials, and increasing the use of secondary materials in manufacture and trade facilitative approaches for reverse supply chains, and the alignment of international standards for a safe, sustainable circular economy will become increasingly important. So as you can see in TESTI, we are working very hard in supporting the progress of these issues through their incubation and development in a way that can, in time, facilitate their debate at the multilateral level. In closing, we want to reaffirm our support and commitment to the Committee on Trade and Environment and welcome the launch of these thematic sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canada. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Japan, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the very informative presentations. I had prepared more longer remarks, but in respect of the time, I'd like to turn this into a question, I think mostly to Araceli from the IEA, but maybe from the other speakers as well. So it was very gratifying to see that there was a mention not only of things like solar panels and wind generators, but also parts, raw materials, related services and storage, as well as energy carriers. And I think there was a lot of mention of trade in hydrogen and derivatives such as ammonium, which are likely to increase in importance as clean energy carriers in the future. So as we look to these new technologies and how they will be used to produce commodities in terms of carbon emissions and during production, it will become more important to have discussions with a wide range of countries, including both developed and developing countries, on how to measure carbon emissions in the production process, for instance, of steel, which is already widely traded, and for instance, with hydrogen, which may be highly traded in the future. So I think the question from me is, I know the IEA is already doing a lot of work in this area. So could you describe a little bit in more detail where we've got to? And a related question is, what would be the role of the WTO? We're not developing the standards here at the WTO per se, but what would be the role that the WTO can play in making sure that we are helping to use that knowledge to reduce barriers to trade? Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Costa Rica, please.
Muchas gracias, facilitadora. Primero, con la venia de mi embajador, me permito hacer esta intervención. Primero, agradeciendo esta sesión temática, el extraordinario panel que nos acompaña, en particular saludando a nuestro antiguo jefe, al exministro Andrés Valenciano, y nos da mucho gusto tenerlo aquí en Ginebra. Y también agradeciéndole a usted, facilitadora, por esta excelente sesión. A continuación, haré una intervención en inglés, haciendo referencia a las preguntas también de esta sesión temática. Perdón, y también agradecer a Canadá por la intervención que hizo en nombre de Costa Rica y Canadá como co-conveners de TESDI. Costa Rica is a small and open economy which believes that trade must encompass sustainability and that environmental policies can in turn trigger trade and investment. Costa Rica's clear political consensus on the fact that environmental protection, climate change policies, and economic growth go hand in hand. In fact, over the last 30 years, we have halted deforestation and doubled the size of our forests while quadrupling per capita income and registering significant growth in trade in goods and services, as well as FDI. Trade and investment represent an equivalent of 80% of Costa Rica's GDP. In addition, more than 500 multinational companies have established operations in the country, many of them from the high-tech and services sectors, and which have positively contributed to the country's well-being in aspects such as green production practices, gender equality policies, training and upgrading of the workforce, contributions to the social security, and upgrading the contribution of Costa Rica's products in the global value chain. The decision of establishment for many of these companies was based on Costa Rica's vision of sustainable development, which aligns with their corporate sustainability objectives. Costa Rica provides a platform for green economic growth of enterprises, with 99% of its energy coming from renewable sources. To this date, we have also reversed deforestation and increased our forest coverage to 59% of our territory. Our tourism sector, strongly based on our nature conservation system, with the economic sector representing 5% of our GDP, is another example of an environmental service. This shared aspiration of green and sustainable growth is part of our value proposition. Our biodiversity approximates 6% of the world's species. Costa Rica has the potential to attract businesses related to research and development of new components for the pharmaceutical industry and on sustainable materials, given this feature, for example. The demand for environmental goods and services is and will continue to increase, presenting an interesting opportunity for developing countries. This market is also crucial for achieving the green transition, but it requires the removal of barriers to trade of green goods and services linked to these technologies. An efficient way to do this is by fostering free trade and reducing protectionism at both the regional and multilateral levels. Foreign direct investment, thus, is key to achieving the green transition, particularly in the developing world. Green FDI creates spillovers such as increasing research and development and human labor skills that foster green technologies in recipient countries. Now, Costa Rica aspires to have a green emission-free, resilient, and equitable economy, and aspires to do this through the National Development and Public Investment Plan 2023-2026. This is a fundamental tool and the second National Development Plan linking to the multi-year investment plan of government priorities and projects to frameworks such as the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. It addresses the transition to a decarbonized economy through the substitution of fossil fuels to renewable sources, which brings benefits in increased resilience to climate change, improved health and quality of life through a decarbonized economy, contributing to this energy transition. We also have a decarbonization plan that incorporates measures to support individuals, communities, and businesses to redirect their activities towards more sustainable and low carbon practices. I have a longer intervention, so I'm going to wrap it up just by closing that with the example of the Payment for Environmental Services program. We have a pioneer effort that compensates landowners and communities for the conservation of forests and natural ecosystems. We have also recently launched a circular economy strategy aiming to become an economy based on the development of knowledge and innovation in strategic areas, prioritizing in agriculture, fisheries and forestry, industry, construction, trade and services, and tourism. So in pursuit of these overall goals, Costa Rica and Canada have launched the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structure discussions at the WTO level, aimed at finding ways to move forward at the multilateral setting. And in addition, we are also negotiating the ACCTS, where we envision that it can become a larger plurilateral agreement contributing to the global deployment of green goods and services. So finally, education and awareness are key. So by educating about the importance of sustainability, our country and many others can foster a sense of collective responsibility and encourage informed decision-making at all levels of society. Thank you very much for giving me so much time.
Thank you, Costa Rica. I have one question in the chat from India. This is a question to Enya, and I'm reading it now. Enya mentioned about emerging subsidies in the US and EU and also state guarantees in Norway. India is asking for a perspective on how you see these measures contributing to the evolution of the industry. Thank you. And as a final speaker for this round of questions, I give the floor to the EU, and then we'll go back to the panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Like Japan, I'm going to skip what the EU is doing. I wanted to start by thanking you, Anna, for moderating these sessions in a very animated and good manner. And we've listened with very high interest to all the panelists. Really an excellent composition of for triggering a good debate. Too much to have half an hour, so there's really a lot of food of thought. I mean, I think many have touched already on the role of trade. TESTI was mentioned, CTE, we heard fossil fuels, etc. I would like to add one. And I think I do it on behalf of 4 co-chairs. We've heard a lot that we need to break through silos, policy coherence. There's a coalition of trade ministers that is trying to do this. We're going to also have some exposure at COP28, looking for a meeting in Davos to break through silos. There are a significant number of participants here. We're co-leading with Ecuador, New Zealand, and Kenya. So I think that that's also an important dimension to it. What I wanted to pick up on is the importance of EGS, environmental goods and services. So facilitating, liberalizing, trading goods, services, and technologies. I was taken by the importance actually that you highlight to that. Not just looking at the tariff, but particularly also the non-tariff area. What I hear is both the sort of NTB side, but also the more how do you design measures side. We've had a discussion on CBAM, interesting points come up, and we are all in for engaging on that important topic. But what struck me is the rapid changes that some of you refer to, and that we need to be able to keep up with that. So one of the questions that comes up is, how do you then go about the definition of goods, services, and technologies? Because you need to build in a flexibility for that. We work in governments, things go slow. It takes years to make an agreement and then years to approve it. And by that time, how do we catch up with that? I think also relevant to think about how we go about this facilitation of environmental goods and services, this relevance of supply chains. I think we are discussing that already increasingly within the WTO context, also the plurilaterals. But you shed really a light on it of the complexity of it. Also because within each of these steps of the supply chains, you see new balances of how we depend on each other. So how do you build that in your EGS exercise, liberalizing your environmental goods and services? And the third element within that that I found very interesting to think about how we build that in is the comment moving Africa from a victim to better untapping its potential by using the comparable advantages in renewables and reducing emissions. I think that the thinking, injecting some of that thinking into how do we go about EGS could be extremely interesting and maybe also unblock us here. I don't think it's a secret that sometimes we are blocked on the EGS discussion as those who are pro-liberalization and those who are con. I think we need to have this more dynamic look that you refer to. So any of the panelists who want to help our thinking in that a little bit further would be welcome. But thanks again.
Great, thank you very much for all your inputs. So we have some comments and feedback on TESTI work streams and sharing of experiences from Costa Rica. We have a few concrete questions. one to the IAE from Japan on measurement of carbon in production. We have a question to Enya from India on subsidies and guarantees. And then we have an overall question to all the panelists on EGS. So I suggest we start with Araceli and then move again forward through the panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the comments and then that particular question. So just to elaborate on that, in particular, I mean, we've been indeed at the IA doing quite some work on, first of all, the definitions for what near zero emissions produced material, and in particular steel and cement, which was the early focus we had, good mean, and then also what would be the associated, let's say, methodologies and frameworks to measure and collect the necessary data really to account for that. And we started this a couple of years ago under the G7 framework as part of the industrial decarbonization agenda that is being put forward by the G7, and at the time was the presidency of Germany. So we, back in 2022, we produced a report where we indeed make a suggestion of what these near zero emissions levels of definitions for steel and cement production could be. Which some of the insights is what I show in the last slide, but of course we have the full report available. But more importantly, beyond the actual threshold of emissions, is about the principles associated with those definitions, which is that they will need to be robust, they will need to be stable, so they could really secure investments and facilitate this process of developing different standards and different agreements within countries. And at the same time, being ambitious enough so that they could be compatible again with the 1.5 trajectory. Earlier this year, the continuation of the G7 agenda under the Japanese presidency put in the agenda as part of the work program to continue with that work. And then the next kind of element of that work stream was actually to look at, what type of data, what type of frameworks to collect this information is out there at the moment, what would be the methodologies that would be required, and how the existing standards were or not fit for that purpose, and what could be a roadmap to transform those frameworks and those standards into, a system where indeed we will have interoperable mechanisms, as it was mentioned, in which, different investors, different companies could really certify their materials under those standards. So we also continue that work, and we produced another report earlier this year under the Japanese presidency, again, suggesting different milestones, different steps that could be taken to, again, develop such a system. We've been also doing work not only on materials, but also on the production of alternative fuels like hydrogen, and what, again, similar methodologies could look like for the, let's say, the definition of low emissions hydrogen and associated fuels. So again, there's been quite a lot of work. Our intention is to continue that. We want to facilitate the discussions across countries and different organizations like standardization bodies like ISO, Responsible Steel, World Steel Association, for example, different related industry partners for the production of these materials. And we're doing this, for example, as part of the discussion of the new working party in industrial decarbonization that has been created at the IEA, in its kind of committee structure, but also in engaging with organizations like WTO, where we've been engaging with them and other bodies to build the momentum for a pledge on, let's say, the principles associated with near zero steel production that could be presented at COP, again, based on the rules from WTO in terms of trade, and also the near zero emission principles that the IEA put forward. So a growing area of work, and we're very eager, again, to bring in more countries into those discussions.
Thank you. Next, Andres, can I please request you to be brief, because we have a lot of flags up at the moment, so we have the possibility to give everyone the chance to intervene. Thank you.
I think on how to move forward with the definition of EGS, I think that's one of a classic example of a complex problem in which the solution won't come from a specific area of knowledge or area of expertise, which again calls for the need to collaborate across disciplines very closely with the environmental organizations and try to define in the most objective way what is the real impact of the trade liberalization of those goods, services, and technologies. So I applaud the initiative of the ministries of trade that are trying to create a working place for those discussions with the environmental agenda. And obviously, the space that was crafted at the COP28 will also help bridge those two communities that have been approaching this issue from different perspectives, and there's a need for policy coherence at every level, including the multilateral one.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the next speaker, I just note that we have 9 requests for the floor. And in order for us to be able to wrap up before lunchtime and maybe go even a little bit over 1, I will have to unfortunately close the speakers list at this point. But please, Antti, you're next.
Thank you very much. So there were discussions related to several many specific trade tools, and I have two very brief comments on this. One is that we could consider bring a time dimension to identifying the environmental friendly goods and services. So one element is that bear in mind that the technologies needed along energy transition towards net zeros will evolve with time, and the composition changes. And second is that supply chain doesn't come and build at once, especially the emerging ones. So for example, the hydrogen, some places are good at development of fuel cells or like charging facilities. And others might be better at the upper stream for the electrolyzers, the production side. So different countries will have different comparative advantages. So trade can facilitate along the time dimension to add these comparative advantages to form a global supply chain. And second, very briefly, so we could consider closer linkage between green FDI and green trade. So with the expertise to be traded along the investment.
Thank you very much. Next, Enya, please.
Hi, thank you. So I'll respond to sort of that question related to subsidies in the EU and the US and beyond. Thanks for a good question. I love to speak about subsidies, so that's great. I think first to start with a concrete example that I started using in my intervention. I mean, obviously the natural immediate effect of the IRA was that a lot of developers were flocking to the US, right? Which resulted in the European Hydrogen Bank being established as sort of a counter response based on the German model, where you go in and mitigate both the cost difference between green and gray, and enabling a long-term offtake agreement. So really great model, really to address those current market barriers. So huge effect, and exactly what the industry is asking for in terms of these market enablers for the green hydrogen market. The pity, however, is that this European Hydrogen Bank, it has a domestic leg and it has an international leg, and the domestic tender for the domestic leg is now starts soon to be tendering, but the international leg is still kind of put on hold, right? So it's not really made a political priority, which I think is a pity, because again, there is a huge untapped potential of green hydrogen projects under development in emerging markets that could play a role in Europe's energy transition. But obviously with the current context, again, we're coming back to sort of discussions around supply chain and taking control of value chains. Like that is a bit the backdrop of where you're seeing kind of capital flows and also support mechanisms are going, right? Your first priority is security of supply and domestic industry formation, right? And then development and third countries is a bit of the second priority, right? But it is a pity, because I think the outcome would have been stronger on both sides if we were able to have two thoughts in our head at the same time. So that's one. Secondly, just to have as a general remark to sort of the impact of subsidies, etc., on driving more investments. Let's not forget, right, that we are in a world that is where fossil fuels are heavily subsidized. It's been like that for decades, and last year was a new record year in terms of subsidizing various forms of fossil fuels. So on that backdrop, I think the issue is that what is happening across countries is that you get a flawed perspective on the actual energy prices, and I think that impedes also the local ownership to the rollout of the green transition in many countries. So that needs to stop. And then secondly, there is the most effective way of sort of subsidizing renewable energy projects in emerging markets is to take down the cost of capital. It's a bit like James was alluding to as well. I mean, the technology cost, technically, cost of renewable electricity is much lower in emerging markets, but the cost of capital makes projects less bankable, right? So obviously, DFIs have a key role to play in terms of offering financing at lower rates in projects and in countries where commercial capital is too expensive because of the risks, right? So that is obviously, those partnerships are really key to us and key to Scatec and other developers. And then guarantees, right? You were mentioning the Norwegian state guarantee. That's another element. In this concrete example, then basically when you have a direct state guarantee, what it means is that Norway would then on behalf of a developing country who don't have the balance sheet to guarantee for an investment, would go in using the strength of the Norwegian balance sheet to strengthen that investment. So that's a really effective tool. But I'll stop there to let the other ones talk.
Thank you, Enya. And next, James, please.
I'll be very brief just to accentuate a point that Enya has already made. If you think about the impact, there's a good news story around the race to the top on green subsidies. I think the better solution, frankly, would be to get rid of the dirty subsidies. First of all, it's better for all concerned. But if you think about, if you buy the idea that developing countries that don't have the fiscal space to actually offer subsidies of any meaningful scale actually have the biggest comparative advantage in some of these sectors, then the impact of these subsidies is, you can see how truly devastating it can be for countries that could ride their green competitiveness into addressing their poverty challenge. We've seen it. It's not theoretical. One of the big challenges that I've had is engaging companies that was very clear that countries like Kenya might be their best deployment locations, who've now said, well, maybe after we've soaked up as much IRA incentive as we can, we'll look at it. So literally delaying economically rational investment by 5 or 10 years. And there's just a question of, can we structure, to the extent that there are these subsidies, can they be structured in a way that limits their negative impact on otherwise competitive developing countries, both for the good of equity, but more importantly, to maximize the climate benefit.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your responses. Now, for the sake of time, I'll take the next 9 requests for the floor in a row, and actually calculating how much time we have left, it would be 2 minutes each. So please keep your remarks brief so that there's a chance for the panel to respond and make their closing remarks. So let's start with New Zealand, to be followed by Brazil. New Zealand, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the facilitator, and in fact to both facilitators for organising this really fascinating session. I also wanted to thank all the panelists. Their interventions were very well informed and thought-provoking, and I think it is the excellence of the panel and their contributions that is partly why we're running so late on time. You've made us all think a lot, and you've stimulated our interest in this. I had initially prepared some remarks that were anchored a little bit in New Zealand's experience and approach before going to the key questions around trade and trade-related policy tools. But in the interests of time, I will skip over that material and focus essentially on the question of where we see the role of trade and trade policy tools in facilitating the clean energy transition. And in that regard, we've been a long-standing proponent of international efforts to ensure that trade and environmental policy are mutually reinforcing. Perhaps the 4 clearest examples of this is the work that we have done in our bilateral and plurilateral FTAs in the area of environmental goods and services to demonstrate how trade liberalisation can deliver both commercial benefits and address climate and other sustainability challenges. Some recent examples of this are the environmental goods and services commitments and chapters that we have negotiated in our FTAs with the UK and the EU recently. In the Asia-Pacific region, New Zealand has been very active in advancing work on environmental and environmentally related services, and working with other partners, have worked to develop a reference list of environmental and environmentally related services and support work leading to the evolution of a model schedule. A third example that has been mentioned a number of times today is the work that we are doing with 4 other partners in negotiating the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, a pathfinder agreement that has chapters covering liberalisation of trade in environmental goods and services, guidelines to support the use of best practice design and implementation of voluntary eco-labelling schemes and disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies. This is designed, as Costa Rica and others have mentioned, to support multilateral discussions, and we hope that we'll be able to share our outcomes in this area in the near future. Finally, New Zealand is a long-standing proponent of fossil fuel subsidy reform and the benefits that this can deliver through transitioning financing away from incentivizing increased use of fossil fuels and towards the clean energy transition and targeted poverty alleviation and development objectives. And we work across a range of international processes, including in APEC and here at the WTO on that. So turning to how that translates into possible action in the WTO, we do believe, and several of the processes that are working on this have been mentioned already this morning, that there's real work that we can do as WTO members, both individually and collectively here in supporting each other to make sure that our trade policy instruments, including tariffs, non-tariff measures such as standards, are aligned with and not contrary to the objective of a low net zero carbon future. Let me focus on two areas. First, facilitating the dissemination of environmental goods, services and technologies through trade. In the area of environmental goods, for example, it's disturbing to see in the research, for example, in a recent UNCTAD study, the extent to which tariffs in some cases favour fossil fuel-derived products or high-energy intensive products, e.g. plastics, chemicals or synthetic materials derived from fossil fuels, over primary product alternatives such as cotton, wool, wood and natural fibres. On environmental services, we see the WTO as well placed to work on approaches to foster trade in environmental and environmentally related services in order to help facilitate the transition to low carbon economies through encouraging the uptake of environmentally sound and climate-friendly services integral to adaptation and climate resilience. Finally, in the area of subsidy reform, we also believe that the WTO has valuable experience and expertise, including established frameworks and institutional processes that can help in conjunction with other international processes to achieve subsidy reform capable of freeing up major resources to support the transition to a low carbon energy future. I think the link is clearest and most direct in the area of fossil fuel subsidies, as has been raised by a number of the panelists and from the floor, but there are other environmentally harmful subsidies, such as in the fisheries and the agriculture sectors, that are distorting production and trade in ways that contribute to higher than optimal energy usage, and where we have important unfinished work to do here at the WTO. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, New Zealand. Next is Brazil, to be followed by Paraguay. Brazil, please.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the presenters for the excellent set of presentations. Being very brief, one remark and two questions. The first one is, as Ms. Pales and other presentations put it very eloquently, there must be a synergy between trade and the energy transition, which is a concept that speaks to the climate regime. And one feature of the climate regime is that obligations between members are not equal, given the fact that there is an asymmetry among countries in their responsibilities for the existing damages to the climate system. This is not only a question of fairness, but also effectiveness, in that developing countries need a certain transition curve to be able to develop the capabilities to address climate changes. And in that sense, a trade approach to climate challenges that do not reflect these differences in obligation is not synergic with the climate regime, and could lead to the two regimes disrupting and blocking the progress between themselves. Then, as for the questions, again, I have to thank Ms. Pales for the excellent presentation, that excellent landscape on the energy transition. And one aspect of the energy transition that always gets our attention is biofuels. The IEA estimates that global biofuels production will need to triple by 2030 2030, and they have proven as a very important input for the decarbonization of certain sectors, particularly transports that are difficult to do by other means. So my question would be, how could biofuels fit into our trajectory for a net zero in 2050? And then my second question is for Mr. Mwangi. I think this was you have made excellent points. In our view, African industrialization is something that cannot be missing from a fair, from a just transition. And if we cannot tap into the potentials that exist in Africa, then I think our pathways for in this transition will be much narrower. It's also very good to see that African leaders are approaching this challenge with the passion that we have demonstrated. I would like to highlight three aspects of the European carbon border mechanism. The first is that it excludes scope 2 emissions coming from electricity in its carbon accountability. So if you have a comparative advantage in generating, for instance, electricity from solar sources, that will not be accounted for in the CBAM. Two, they apply parameters and metrics that are peculiar to the European market and that are very costful for external producers to apply. So it really eats into one's margin. By all means, please. Yes, of course. Let me try again. Apparently there was a problem with the translators. So can you hear me well now? Okay, then. And so these parameters and metrics are very costful to implement by producers outside of Europe and eat into their margins. Third, the CBAM is being implemented in association with subsidies to the factor of more than $200 billion that help to build European capacities to both produce products from green sources and comply with the parameters and metrics that I was just mentioning. And there are already a few projections of the impacts of that, which result in a very uneven playing field for business outside of Europe, especially considering the financial and technological constraints that exist in Africa and Latin America. A 2021 study by UNCTAD has concluded that the CBAM can result in a minimum reduction in global emissions by 0.1%, while it will cause a loss of welfare of about $50 billion in developing countries, and then have a major impoverishment effect on the African continent. In light of this observations, I would ask you which changes to that regime you think would be most important for your vision as carbon accounting, as an accelerator of the correct deployment of productive capacities to realize, as well as how African governments can navigate this uneven playing field. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Next is Paraguay, to be followed by the Russian Federation. Kindly keep your remarks as brief as possible for the sake of time. Please go ahead.
Thank you, moderator, and I will do my best. Voy a hablar un poco rápido, así que pido disculpas a los intérpretes. Si en algún momento se pierden, puedo pasar la intervención más larga. Quisiera señalar unos puntos interesantes de la presentación del señor Andrés Valenciano con respecto a las oportunidades de la región, pero también las dificultades y mencionó algunas como la deuda y en general el limitado espacio fiscal. Había preparado una intervención más larga, como les dije, pero dado el poco tiempo, la cortaré y saltaré lo más rápido posible las preguntas. Con respecto a los CBAMs, creo que dejó clara, me refiero a la presentación del señor Valenciano, las posibles salidas y mejoras en el desarrollo de estas medidas para solucionar los problemas. Me permito, sin embargo, sumar también la necesidad de no solo una reducción en el costo adicional que implicarían los mecanismos de CBAM, sino además un acceso a mercado preferencial para productos, por ejemplo, con una huella de carbono menor o neutra gracias a los servicios ecosistémicos brindados sin retribución en muchos, si no todos los países de la región. Como les digo, sobre los IVAs no tengo más que agregar, en especial luego los excelentes comentarios del señor Irungo. Solo decir que las zanahorias y no solo los palos son necesarios si queremos que este tipo de medidas cumplan su objetivo y atraigan inversión a pesar de las otras desventajas y riesgos en la región y nos permita explotar el potencial de estas regiones. Sobre transferencia de tecnología y cooperación, también creo que lo dejó muy claro, así que salto. Es en la liberalización de bienes y servicios ambientales, donde quisiera profundizar y realizar una pregunta. Como esta, me gustaría saber cómo esta eventual liberalización, en especial en lo que refiere a aranceles de por sí bajos, dado que los listados incluyen sobre todo o exclusivamente bienes no agrícolas o NAMA, y no incluyen, por ejemplo, bienes ambientalmente preferibles, se acopla o funciona en la práctica, teniendo en cuenta que reduciría todavía más el espacio fiscal de los países sin las ventajas económicas para la producción actual o para apoyar la industrialización verde y a la vez imposibilitarían el desarrollo sostenible. Esta pregunta es, por supuesto, para el señor Valenciano, pero en general a todos los oradores que hablaron de los desafíos para para que los países en desarrollo puedan explotar sus ventajas comparativas y desarrollarse sosteniblemente y contribuir incluso a la transición de otros países. Con respecto, el otro, saltando un poco, la otra pregunta general es sobre un elemento importante que quizás no fue tan discutido el día de hoy, que es la adaptación al cambio climático. Debido a la situación geográfica, dependencia en algunos casos a la agricultura, pero en especial a las desventajas estructurales de muchos países en desarrollo, somos especialmente afectados por el cambio climático y el reducido espacio fiscal mencionado limita la capacidad de adaptación. Esto se puede atender con cooperación, pero también y de una forma todavía más eficiente, brindando los incentivos económicos necesarios en términos nuevamente de zanahorias y no solo palos, que usando nuevamente las palabras del señor Irungo, fuera de contexto, destruyen donde ya no hay mucho y no ayudan a construir. Así que una pregunta a todos los oradores sería cómo consideran que la OMC puede contribuir a esto desde su área de acción y sus reglas. En especial, por ejemplo, considerando el surgimiento de algunas medidas unilaterales que desbalancean aún más el campo de juego, distorsionando el mercado y manteniendo ventajas comparativas artificiales que no permiten explotar las ventajas comparativas, por ejemplo, en energías renovables de países en desarrollo y menos adelantados, ni brindar suficiente retribución a los servicios ecosistémicos. En pocas palabras, cómo disciplinar los palos, que es lo que la OMC puede hacer, para al menos permitir que el mercado pueda brindar por sí mismo las zanahorias. Pero también, con respecto a los subsidios que ya fueron mencionados, estos son un juego que solo algunos países pueden jugar y una flexibilización de las reglas que permitan o faciliten una carrera por subsidiar dejaría a algunos países perdiendo desde el inicio. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Paraguay. Next is Russian Federation to be followed by Chile. Russian Federation, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I can't help but thank also the panelists who are in this room now for their very comprehensive and helpful presentations. For the sake of time, I'm going to be brief. I just have a couple of questions and one remark. Questions I would like to ask to the distinguished representative of the International Energy Agency. The first one regards the steel products, mining and critical raw materials, because during your presentation you mentioned, you've highlighted the importance of these products for the energy transition. So the question is, shouldn't we include them on the potential list of environmental goods and work towards liberalization of trade in them? In order to make them as affordable and available as possible. The second one regards hydrogen. Hydrogen is considered as an important component of energy transition. I think nobody is going to argue with me on this matter. In order to deploy capacities of hydrogen generation, obviously we need to increase competitive advantages of this energy source. And it's common knowledge that hydrogen derived from the natural gas or associated gases is much more affordable rather than the one produced of renewables. So given that, is this fact compatible with the different calling on to eliminate fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies? And finally, my remark regards low carbon steel, which was mentioned by several panelists. Again, IE has highlighted the importance of development of the standards for such products, different definitions, and so on. In order to encourage trade in different sustainable steel and aluminum, etc. So in my opinion, these standards, this direction will require also new harmonized system classification of such products, because we will need to ensure sustainable and stable and stable trade with no obstacles, including customs and administrative procedures, which may be excessive. For this reason, the question is that how are we going to develop this HS classification based on the way and manner of manufacturing, rather than consumption properties of the final products, which seems to me quite difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Russian Federation. Next, I have Chile, to be followed by Kenya. Chile, please.
Muchas gracias y agradecemos a las moderadoras por la organización de esta sesión, que ha sido muy sustantiva, y a los presentadores por sus muy interesantes visiones. Quisiera hacer un par de reflexiones a partir de la experiencia de mi país. En 2010, solo el 1% de la energía en Chile se produjo a partir de fuentes renovables y el 30% procedía de centrales de carbón. Este año podemos decir con orgullo que el 34% de nuestra energía proviene de las fuentes renovables y que la energía térmica, carbón, ha disminuido hasta el 18%. El comercio tenía un rol relevante en esta transición, ya que nuestros acuerdos de libre comercio nos han permitido acceder a bienes que se utilizan en el desarrollo de las energías renovables con aranceles preferenciales. Pero no es el único. El contar con reglas claras y permanentes también ayudan en el desarrollo de este y otros sectores. Actualmente trabajamos para un segundo tiempo en la construcción de una matriz energética más limpia, incluyendo a través de la Ley Marco de Cambio Climático, que establece instrumentos de gestión climática y define el objetivo de ser carbono neutral en el año 2050, identificando 4 pilares: eficiencia energética, energías renovables, transporte sostenible e hidrógeno verde. En todo ello, el comercio tiene un rol. Por ejemplo, el comercio de bienes más eficientes energéticamente, de electrolizadores, de vehículos más limpios, de hidrógeno y de otros bienes, de una manera que sea expedita, que evite obstáculos técnicos, requerimientos innecesarios u otros. A lo anterior se suman los servicios asociados a todos estos sectores y cómo el comercio puede apoyar para que estos servicios lleguen a ellos. En esta sesión fue posible apreciar el importante número de elementos involucrados en la transición energética, lo que nos lleva a preguntarnos cómo hacer para que el comercio contribuya más al combate del cambio climático y qué materias deberíamos priorizar para que el comercio beneficie a todos y contribuya a distintos sectores al logro de las metas de neutralidad que tienen diferentes miembros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Chile. Next is Kenya, to be followed by Australia. Kenya, please.
Thank you, facilitator. I make this intervention on behalf of the ACP group. We welcome the launch of this thematic session and commend the facilitator and the panelists for the excellent presentations and perspectives on energy transition in the context of the multilateral trading system. Trade can contribute towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 7 in supporting access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. As reflected in the 2022 WTO trade report, green hydrogen could catalyze the trade in renewable energy across borders. Improved technology and diffusion of technology could contribute towards reducing the cost of producing and storing hydrogen and accordingly bringing down its price. However, available financing for scaling energy availability in developing countries has been declining. Yet, developing countries, particularly in the ACP region, have a substantial proportion of the world's renewable energy resources. As has been alluded to by the panelists, Africa, for instance, has an estimated 40% of the world's renewable energy resources, but receives less than 2% of renewable energy investment. SDG Target 7 mandates the diffusion of funding in support of clean energy research and development and renewable energy production. Therefore, unlocking climate growth potential on a scale that can contribute meaningfully to decarbonization of the global economy will require several multiples of the current development and investment finance flows. Regional integration to build economies of scale for the production of renewable energy constitutes a means to promote harmonized production and service markets and supporting joint learning in relation to the various types of renewable energy. In terms of the role of the WTO in promoting tools and providing an institutional framework, the ACP group considers that the WTO provides a forum to promote transparency along the global value chains for the assembly and production of goods that form the backbone of renewable energy generation, such as technical requirements. Compilation of the various measures in place could be a first step. Members could then discuss how best to cooperate and to harmonize and streamline procedures without diminishing policy space and the right to regulate. The WTO could also foster various forms of technical assistance and capacity building programs catered to MSMEs in developing countries and LDCs with a view to training them to comply with international standards linked to renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenya. Next is Australia, to be followed by Norway. Australia, please.
Thank you, facilitator and panelists, for the excellent session this morning. It's a pleasure to be here from Australia and to take the floor as one of the last barriers between you and your lunch. But noting that I have travelled from Australia, I just wanted to briefly put on the record some of our perspectives, but I have cut it down. So I look forward to discussing it in a little bit more detail this afternoon and tomorrow. Like other members, Australia believes that trade is and must continue to be part of the solution to environmental problems and the climate crisis. We want to do more on trade and climate, including here at the CTE through TESID, the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution, the Coalition on Trade Ministers, and also the Climate Club. We also want ministers to discuss trade and climate nexus at MC13. Our broad aim is for there to be maximum consistency of trade and climate policies. The climate crisis is a shared challenge, and Australia is committed to delivering effective action. We have legislated our 2030 emissions reduction target of 43% below 2005 levels, putting Australia on track to achieve our net zero emissions by 2050. We have also set an 82% renewable electricity target by 2030, with accompanying investments in transmission, storage, and generation. Trade is crucial for our ambitions, and we are committed to leveraging our renewable resources and critical mineral endowments to remain a stable and trusted supplier of energy to our partners through the global transformation to net zero. We are investing over $40 billion in our plan to tackle climate change and become a renewable energy superpower. Our ambition to become a renewable energy superpower and build new renewable industries will also assist in global decarbonisation efforts. In addition to reducing our own emissions, we want to build new clean energy industries to support our trading partners as they transition. We will also increase domestic energy security and that of our partners. And trade will, of course, be fundamental to achieving these goals. As other countries increase action to meet their emissions reduction targets, their demand for sustainable energy, resources, and products will grow. Already over 95% of the value of our exports are to countries that have committed to net zero emissions by 2050. Standardized, internationally aligned climate reporting requirements will also be important to assist businesses to be able to calculate emissions in hydrogen and renewable energy sectors. So to help Australia produce and export hydrogen and other clean products at scale, we are developing a world-leading guarantee of origin scheme. Noting the time, I'll leave it there, but I look forward to engaging with all members further on this issue later today and next week at TESID. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Australia. Next, Norway, please, to be followed by UK. Norway, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. And first, thanks to the CTE chair and moderators for organizing this first thematic session, and to the panelists for excellent presentations. I did have a longer intervention, but will limit it to 2 short comments relating to the questions in the invitation. First and foremost, Norway believes that international trade can increase the diffusion of environmental goods and services, reduce their costs, as well as spread technologies. Solar panels and wind turbines are prime examples of low-emission goods and services that contribute to more efficient and better solutions. Global value chains are essential in this regard and must be secure and resilient. Wind turbines, for instance, have up to 9,000 different components. It is equally important to promote common standards and definitions, as well as incentives for low emissions technology. And several speakers in the panel also highlighted this. Secondly, the WTO can deliver contributions to solving our common environmental challenges. These are cross-cutting global issues that are part of the work on subsidies, on facilitating trade in environmental goods and services, on circular economy and contributing to the fight against plastic pollution, on trade restrictive measures to reduce them, on tech transfer, and more. The whole membership needs to work on green solutions and find their respective comparative advantages, including through negotiations in the WTO, taking the interests of developing and least developed members duly into account. In Norway's view, the 3 joint statement initiatives on trade and environment, the TESDI, the DPP, the Plastic Initiative, and the fossil fuel subsidies reform are discussing very relevant issues, of which several could be lifted to the multilateral level when the time is right. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Norway. And last but not least, UK, please, you have the floor.
First of all, thank you, Anna, for getting us started on the first thematic session, and to all of the panelists for your thoughtful presentations. Like others, I will try to keep my remarks brief. First, we would like to start by welcoming the intervention from Canada on the work of the TESDI. The UK has been working with members of the TESDI to discuss urgent environmental challenges and the role that trade plays in combating them. We have produced 3 papers on solar PV, offshore wind, and low carbon hydrogen, respectively. These technical papers use value chain analysis to assess the relationship between trade, production, and the environment for key environmental technologies. This is a way to capture related policy considerations and to explore issues such as classification challenges, life cycle issues, the environmental and economic interests of countries on different development pathways, tangible and technical links between goods and services, where and how barriers to trade apply to or affect trade in environmental goods and services, and opportunities for voluntary technology transfer on mutually agreed terms. We think that developing a sound evidence base can help trade officials, industry policymakers, businesses, and governments at all stages of development in thinking about supporting a just energy transition, including how developing countries can participate in and benefit from these value chains for environmental goods and services. We'd like to suggest that the CTE does more to facilitate these types of evidence-based discussion. We have also been looking more holistically at challenges and trade bottlenecks to trade in environmental goods. On standards specifically, we recognize that different country requirements can lead to the development and applicability of different standards, which, when used as a basis for technical regulations, lead to further regulatory divergence. As new international standards develop in this space, we particularly encourage experts from across the world to engage in technical committees run by international standards-making bodies. With greater expertise and broad involvement, we can ensure the development of standards that have wide applicability and account for diverse market needs, supporting businesses operating across an increasingly globalized market. Reflecting on the intervention from New Zealand, we can also learn from the work that the UK and other countries are doing bilaterally across the world to resolve barriers to trade for offshore wind. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all members who intervened. Now I'd like to give the floor back to the panel in reverse order now. So we will start with James, and please feel free to respond to questions and comments by members, and also you may give your concluding remarks, if any. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll focus my remarks on the question and comments made by Brazil, which I couldn't agree more with. I think the 2 things are true, 2 contradictory things are true at the same time. The first is the current structuring of some of these agreements with exclusions such as exclusion of scope 2, the ignorance of subsidies, the lack of funding for building or monitoring capacity, and so on, basically render them unlikely to deliver any of the benefits that they're supposed to deliver. The second thing that is potentially viewed as contradictory but is actually aligned is that we need mechanisms that work towards the things that these mechanisms say they're working towards in order to realize the future that we want. So we do need to actually outline. I think my whole point has been that subject to fixing those and a few other things, these could be mechanisms that are actually tailwinds rather than headwinds for developing countries, but they require everyone recognizing that to maximize their carbon impact requires us to do things a little bit differently than they're currently being done. The other thing I just want to remark on is the biofuels point. I do think that there's a really interesting set of questions there. Less on terrestrial transport. I do think that the game there is going to go to battery transport, maybe hydrogen. But I think 3 areas where we are really excited, certainly at ACV, about the role of biofuels. The first one is cleaning up cooking. You burn a biofuel like ethanol and you end up with water vapor and carbon dioxide as your only indoor emissions. Transformative for respiratory health in much of the world, and better, frankly, than LPG as a cooking fuel. And the other two being the 2 areas where you will continue to require high density energy carriers, and that's aviation and shipping, where I do think that there's the more that we can begin to explicitly focus biofuels on these sectors, which will be difficult for either fossil fuels or other alternatives to play in, the more that we can really build an overall global consensus and then focus on the areas where we're not also displacing food. And then beyond that, I think is that whole notion of, across all of these questions, I do think that all of us really pivoting towards a problem-solving mindset around saying, how could a framework work for a particular agreement, or where are the areas where we may want to use a particular solution versus another, allows us to find a whole lot of opportunities for net reductions in emissions that aren't necessarily bound by dogma. So, for example, there will be countries where increasing use of natural gas is a useful transitional step. But there's also countries where it's a distraction from tapping their full renewables potential. So how do we carry those contradictory impulses at this moment of creative acceleration towards the net zero goals is, I think, the question I'll leave us all with as my closing question.
Thank you very much, James. Next, Enya, please. Any responses or final remarks?
Yeah, thank you. I started my first intervention with sort of with the momentum and opportunities that's coming out of sort of the current geopolitical context. And while that is true, I also want to sort of raise how the current context is also making, the renewable energy transition more expensive, more complex, and more volatile, right? I mean, that is the current context we're in, although the market fundamentals are obviously just speaking one way, namely up. But I think currently we are in a context where the overarching political priority it is security supply, ideally green, but not at any cost, right? We're speaking about financing costs that are increasing with increasing interest rates. That makes project profitability more challenging, also makes it more difficult to land on offtake agreements in a market that is not only state utilities, but different market players on the offtake side. And not the least, I think we see a lot of countries, both at the national level and the local level, both in Europe and across the globe, struggling to convince local communities to support sort of the build out of more renewable energy, whether that is out of environmental concerns or out of fear of lost jobs and opportunities, meaning that the energy transition has become more polarized, right? So I would say, obviously, there is a very important role for WTO, governments, and the likes to support kind of the build-up of renewables in terms of, financing instruments that can help take down the cost of capital and catalyze more investments in terms of, building stronger framework conditions in countries, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that the most important task ahead of us, for all of us across governments, organizations like WTO, and business, is to really work with establishing sort of the public ownership to the green transition. That is the only way we can really solve this climate crisis. And I think from a company perspective, that is about sort of having our social license to operate really as the backbone of everything we do. And I think from the perspective of WTO and governments, it's about sort of creating the foundations for a green transition that is also a just energy transition. So that's, I think, the last appeal I want to make, which I do think is the overarching most important thing we can focus on.
Thank you very much, Enya. Next, Antti, you have the floor.
Thank you. I've got two comments and I'll conclude after that. So one is about fossil fuel subsidies mentioned by a lot of speakers. Well, I think that we can look at two sides of this issue. One side is that since 2009, the G20 APEC committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in midterms. It's many years past. Well, in 2016, China and the United States were the first pair under G20 to carry out a voluntary peer review for inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But it's proven that this is a very important issue, however, quite challenging to solve. So while we're continuing, like in New Zealand for many years for the FFSR framework, so while we're continuing on strengthening these efforts, we on the other side can try to, by trade, lowering the costs of new energy. Like for example, if EVs are getting so cheap and so high quality, and on the back seat you can get a new, kind of film screen in your car and get a battery for your barbecue outdoor. This kind of new lifestyle formed by EVs, then nobody will buy petrol cars. Or if renewables are cheap enough in many places in the world now, and next stage, if renewables plus flexibilities are cheap enough, then fossil fuel power, thermal powers will be phased out naturally. So there are two sides that we should put equal efforts in. And second comment is that we had a lot of very good discussion today on mitigation, but our title for this discussion is mitigation and adaptation. So just with this more frequently extreme weathers, floods, storms, etc. So we should pay more attention to the adaptation needs and services and goods needs, especially in the developing countries who are more vulnerable to be response to these challenges. So, well, I would like to conclude by that I've learned a lot today, and this is really beneficial discussions. In general, energy transition opens up a quite large volume of new emerging services and good and chances, opportunities of the formation of new trade partners. And trade here is in the center to find the optimization between the prosperity, mitigation of climate change, as well as inclusive social development. So the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are a lot of tasks we could do, like from energy researchers' point of view, we could provide more references to the trade experts on what is needed in the future, etc. And I look forward to this kind of joint efforts. Thanks.
Thank you, Antti. Next, Andres, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone for the comments, questions, and a very engaging conversation it has been. Just to wrap up, I think it's rightly pointed out by Paraguay, and I think this applies to many developing countries around the world. Like I mentioned, they're not only on a very tight fiscal position, highly indebted, but many of them still depend on the exports of fossil fuels. So we really have to frame this as a just transition. I know the word gets thrown around, but when we're talking about a just transition, it takes into account the different stages of development that every country is in. It takes into account that if we're talking about the trade liberalization of environmental goods and services and technologies, we have to really assess what is the impact on the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, and at the same time might be the ones that are less contributing to it. It also takes into account a further and more rigorous monitoring and design and monitoring of mechanisms like CBAM, precisely to avoid all the things that have been mentioned today about the potentially negative consequences of mechanisms such as that. And it also forces us to review initiatives, for example, as the Aid for Trade and capacity building and financing of initiatives that are trying to create the capacity, the institutional capacity in developing countries. Where is it allocated? Who is it impacting the most? We have to make sure that we have that lens of a just transition, because it's in the interest of everyone. I think the argument has been very clear of how regions like Latin America and Africa and developing countries in the global south in general have to be part of the energy transition. And in order to do so, it will require that we make sure that all these discussions are also analyzed through the lens of those that are the most vulnerable ones, but also have enormous potential to contribute to this global agenda. So more collaborative, participatory approach to many of these discussions across disciplines will be required, and I hope that we can contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. And next, Araceli, please.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting discussion. And just to wrap up, so I'll try to respond to the couple of questions and then just a quick comment. First, I think in terms of the role of bioenergy and biofuels in the clean energy transition more broadly, indeed, I think as has been mentioned before, from our analysis, we also see biofuels, bioenergy more broadly as a key pillar for decarbonization, in particular, given the advantage of, that in most applications we can consider is a drop-in fuel, so that, we could really, it can really help accelerate progress in quite a few areas where other alternatives to reduce emissions are not readily available on the market. My colleague mentioned particularly areas, with high density, so long distance transport, for example, that's a key area to focus on. And just to complement that by saying that, we have to keep in mind as well that bioenergy is not an unlimited resource, and we have to be very wary with synergies and implications with other bio-related supply chains, like food, other agriculture applications, etc. And this is something we really take very much into account in our analysis. And that's why, that's not the only solution, but we need to look at alternatives as well to complement that. Just quickly on the comment from Russia, the Russian Federation on steel and hydrogen. So indeed, in our perspective, there's some of the, let's say, more established materials like steel, aluminum, different primary, chemical commodities, cement, etc., that could still keep being fundamental ingredients in our societies when we move towards a clean energy system. The key difference from new commodities is that we need to look at how they can be transformed in terms of the processes that produce those commodities so that they are compatible with the trajectory towards near zero or net zero emissions. And this is where the key need for differentiation schemes comes in, to make sure that those commodities can, let's say, live with other listed under this, environmental goods and services in such a way that is transparent. The idea of how they have been produced, what type of environmental footprint they have incurred in those processes. And so this is the key distinction we need to make, and this is where definitions become really critical. Similarly for hydrogen, so hydrogen would be, like, say, an increasingly important commodity in this transition, but hydrogen can be produced through different routes. And again, here, that's the need to, very, very clear and transparent about what these routes have been, and again, incentivizing these differentiating schemes to make sure that, the purchase of those commodities, has all the information at hand. And just echoing that element, just want to make a final point. Indeed, very much agree with the comments made that trade really is at the core of how we could accelerate this clean energy transition. But at the same time, we don't have to talk about trade, in the overall scheme of things, and having let's say, a general solution that applies to all the trade challenges here. So I think we have to be very targeted, very specific, and look for tailored solutions that, again, can facilitate trade to diffuse technologies, to lower the cost of those technologies, and to ensure, again, that the transition is fast, is just, is resilient, is secure, and sustainable. So we need to look at these different schemes together. And from the IA, very happy to keep working with yourselves.
Thank you very much. Those are good words to wrap up. We've come to the end of a very, very rich discussion. I won't try to summarize the discussion now, but a report will be provided to the CTE tomorrow. I think we could have used much more time, and this shows the importance and complexity of the topic. And given the high level of interest, the members might want to consider continuing and deepening the discussion in the future to enrich the work of the CTE. So I'd very much like to thank all the panelists. You've been great. I'd like to thank members who intervened, shared their experience and asked questions. Thank you to the CTE Chair, Ambassador Valencia. Thank you to the Secretariat team, and thank you also to the interpreters for your especially for your extra time. And with that, I'd like to thank all the participants and wish you have a great, slightly delayed lunch break. The meeting is closed. Thank you so much. Really great.